Do you hear it? The walls of the silver oak have started to whisper. I am NightSleepWhisper, and tonight, I will be your guide through 50 chapters. Mark's story begins long, mysterious, and profoundly peaceful. Close all the doors in your mind and just follow my voice. Welcome to the safest harbor of sleep. Mark stood in front of the silver oak apartments. He held a heavy box in his arms. It was a warm afternoon in September. The building was tall and made of grey stone. It looked very clean and very quiet. Mark was 30 years old, and this was his first day in the city. He wanted a fresh start and a peaceful place to live. He walked through the glass front doors. The lobby was beautiful. There were 2 large plants in the corners and a long leather sofa against the wall. It felt more like a quiet hotel than an apartment building. A man walked out of a small office near the stairs. He wore a dark suit and a very small, polite smile. "You must be Mark," the man said. His voice was low and very calm. "I am Mr. Henderson. I manage this building." We spoke on the phone. "Yes, hello," Mark said. He tried to move the heavy box in his arms. "It is nice to meet you." Mr. Henderson reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver key. He held it out to Mark. "Everything is ready for you in apartment 3B. It is a very good room. It is at the end of the hall, so it is very private." "Thank you," Mark replied. He took the key. "Is the building usually this quiet?" Mr. Henderson nodded slowly. His eyes were sharp and stayed on Mark's face. "Our tenants like their privacy. We do not have many parties here. People keep to themselves. I think you will like it." Mark walked to the elevator. He pressed a round metal button. A small light turned on, and the doors opened. Inside, the elevator was bright and smelled like lemon soap. He pressed the button for the 3rd floor. As the doors closed, he saw Mr. Henderson still standing in the lobby, watching him. The 3rd floor was just as quiet as the lobby. The hallway was long and covered in a soft, blue carpet. Mark's footsteps did not make any noise. He found the door with the number 3B. He put the silver key into the lock and turned it. The door opened easily. The apartment was empty and very bright. The walls were painted white, and the floor was made of dark, shining wood. There was a large window in the living room. Mark put his box on the floor and walked to the window. He looked down at the street below. He saw people walking quickly to work and cars moving in long lines. Up here, he could not hear the city at all. He felt a little bit nervous, but also excited. This was his new life. He began to unpack his things. He took out a clock, a lamp, and some books. He put the lamp on a small table. He wondered about his neighbors. He wondered who lived in the rooms next to him. The building felt very still, like it was waiting for something to happen. Mark closed the window and locked it tightly. Mark finished opening his 2nd box of books. He felt tired and very hungry. He looked at his watch. It was already 6 o'clock in the evening. He decided to go outside to find a small restaurant or a local cafe. He put on his light jacket and took his new keys from the wooden table. He wanted to explore the neighborhood before it became too dark. He opened his front door and stepped into the long hallway. The blue carpet felt very soft under his shoes. The hallway was still very quiet, and the lights were a little dim. He walked toward the elevator. Suddenly, the elevator doors opened. A woman stepped out. She was carrying a small bag of groceries and a single yellow flower. She had long, brown hair and a kind, intelligent face. She wore a green dress and a light grey coat. When she saw Mark, she stopped and smiled. "Oh, hello," she said. Her voice was cheerful and bright. "Are you the new neighbor in 3B? I saw the moving truck outside this morning." "Yes, I am," Mark answered. He smiled back at her. "My name is Mark. I just moved in today. I'm still unpacking all my boxes." The woman put her grocery bag on the floor for a moment. She held out her hand to him. "I am Elena. I live in apartment 4B. That is directly above your new home. It is very nice to finally have a neighbor again. The man who lived in 3B before you was very quiet. He almost never came out of his room, and then he left very suddenly." Mark shook her hand. Her hand was cold, but her handshake was firm. "It is nice to meet you, Elena. Mr. Henderson told me that the building is very quiet. I like that. I need a peaceful place to work." Elena looked down the long, empty hallway. She looked back at Mark and lowered her voice a little bit. "It is quiet, yes. But sometimes it feels a bit too quiet here. You know? Everyone in this building likes to keep to themselves. Sometimes it feels like everyone has a secret. But don't worry about that today. You are new. Are you going out for dinner? I'm looking for a good place to eat." Mark said, "There is a very good Italian restaurant only 2 blocks away." Elena suggested. She pointed toward the front doors. "The food is fresh and the people are very friendly. I go there often when I do not want to cook." "Thank you for the help." Mark said, "I think I will try it." Elena picked up her grocery bag and her flour. "Welcome to Silver Oak, Mark. I hope you have a very good first night here. If you need any sugar or more help, just come to 4B." She walked toward the stairs at the end of the hall. Mark watched her go. She seemed very nice, but he wondered what she meant about the secrets of the building. He stepped into the elevator and the doors closed smoothly. He felt happy that he met a friendly person on his first day. He thought about the Italian restaurant and the warm food. The city outside was busy, but inside the Silver Oak apartments, everything felt strange, still, and very mysterious. Mark returned to his apartment after dinner. The pasta at the restaurant was very good, and the walk back helped him relax. He entered the Silver Oak lobby. It was dark now. Only one light was on near the manager's office. Mr. Henderson was not there. Mark took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. He felt comfortable in his new space and ready to sleep. He brushed his teeth and put on his pajamas. He turned off the lights in the living room. The city lights came through the large window, making long shadows on the wooden floor. He went into his bedroom and climbed into bed. The sheets were new and clean. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence. It was a very deep silence. He could not hear any cars or people from the street. He felt very safe. Suddenly, something changed. Above him, in Elena's apartment, there was a loud noise. It was not a small noise like a dropped glass or a falling book. It was the sound of something very heavy hitting the floor with a lot of force. The floorboards above his head shook for a second. The sound was sudden and very hard. Mark opened his eyes quickly. He sat up in bed and looked at the white ceiling. What was that? He whispered to himself. He waited for another sound. He expected to hear Elena's voice or perhaps the sound of someone walking to see what fell. He waited for 1 minute, then 2 minutes, but there was nothing. The building was silent again. He stayed very still. His heart was beating a little faster now. He thought about Elena's kind face and her yellow flower. Maybe she fell down. Or maybe she moved a large piece of furniture. But it was midnight. Why was she moving heavy things at midnight? Mark got out of bed and walked to the middle of the room. He stood directly under the place where the sound came from. He leaned his head back and listened. He heard a very faint sound now. It was the sound of something sliding slowly across the floor. It was a dragging sound. Then, he heard the sound of a door closing firmly. Mark went to his window and looked out. The street was empty and the streetlights were bright. He looked up at the fourth floor, but he could not see Elena's window from his position. He felt a strange worry in his stomach. He wanted to go upstairs and knock on her door to ask if she was okay, but he did not want to be a difficult neighbor on his first night. He did not want to seem strange. He went back to bed, but he did not close his eyes for a long time. He watched the shadows on the ceiling and waited for a sound that never came back. The next morning, the sun was bright and the sky was blue. Mark woke up at 8 o'clock. He felt a little tired because he did not sleep well. The strange sound from the night before was still in his mind. He made a cup of coffee and sat at his small kitchen table. He looked at the white ceiling. Everything was quiet now. There were no dragging sounds and no heavy thudding noises. Maybe it was just a dream, Mark said to himself. But he knew it was not a dream. The sound was very real. He decided to go to work. He worked as a writer for a travel magazine, and he had a lot of work to do. But before he left the building, he wanted to see Elena. He wanted to make sure she was okay. He felt responsible because they were neighbors. He put on his shoes and walked out of his apartment. Instead of going down to the lobby, Mark pressed the button for the fourth floor. The elevator moved up slowly. When the doors opened, Mark stepped out. The fourth floor looked exactly like the third floor. It had the same blue carpet and the same dim lights. He walked down the hall to apartment 4B. He stood in front of Elena's door. He was ready to knock, but then he looked down at the floor. Something was shining on the blue carpet. It was right in front of Elena's door. Mark bent down and picked it up. It was a set of keys on a silver ring. There were 3 keys and a small plastic keychain. The keychain was a small, bright yellow flower. Mark remembered the flower Elena held in her hand the day before. These were definitely her keys. He felt a cold shiver on his back. Why were her keys on the floor in the hallway? Usually, people keep their keys in their pockets or their bags. Mark looked at the door. It was closed, but it did not look completely shut. There was a very small gap between the door and the frame. He reached out his hand and touched the wood. He did not knock yet. He listened carefully. He did not hear a television. He did not hear any music. He did not even hear the sound of someone breathing. "Elena!" He called out softly. "Elena, are you there? You dropped your keys." There was no answer. Mark looked at the keys in his hand. The yellow flower looked cheerful, but Mark felt very worried. He looked at the long, empty hallway behind him. He felt like someone was watching him from the shadows. He put the keys in his pocket. He decided he could not leave them on the floor. He decided to wait a few minutes, but the silence from inside the apartment was heavy and strange. Mark decided not to enter Elena's apartment. He felt it was wrong to walk into a neighbor's home without an invitation, even if the door was open and the keys were on the floor. He stood in the hallway for another minute. He hoped to hear her walking inside or perhaps the sound of water in the kitchen. But the apartment was as silent as a grave. He took a deep breath and walked back to the elevator. He traveled down to the ground floor. When the elevator doors opened, the lobby was still empty. The morning sun was shining through the large glass doors, making the floor look very bright. Mark walked toward the wall of silver mailboxes. Each box had a small number on it. He found his own mailbox, number 3B. He opened it with his new key, but it was empty. He expected this because he only arrived yesterday. Then, he looked at the mailbox for apartment 4B. This was Elena's mailbox. Mark stopped and looked closely. The small window on the box showed a lot of paper inside. There were several white envelopes, a thick, colorful magazine, and a few folded advertisements. One of the envelopes was stuck in the small metal slot because the box was so full. Mark felt a knot in his stomach. Yesterday, Elena told him she lived in the building and she had a grocery bag with a fresh flower. She looked like she was part of a normal routine. But mail does not pile up like this in only one night. It looked like nobody had opened that mailbox for 3 or 4 days. That is very strange. Mark whispered. If Elena was home yesterday, why didn't she take her mail? If she was going on a trip, why did she buy fresh groceries and a flower? Nothing felt right. The heavy sound from the night before, the dropped keys, the open door, and now the full mailbox. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces. Suddenly, Mark felt a presence behind him. He turned around quickly. Mr. Henderson was standing near the office door. The manager was wearing the same dark suit as the day before. He was holding a glass of water and watching Mark with a blank expression on his face. "Is there a problem with your mail, Mark?" Mr. Henderson asked. His voice was flat and gave no emotion. Mark hid Elena's keys in his pocket. He didn't want the manager to see them yet. "No, Mr. Henderson. I was just checking my box. It is empty, of course." "I see," the manager said. He walked a few steps closer. "And why are you looking at mailbox 4B? Each tenant must only look at their own box. We value privacy here, remember." "I was just noticing it was very full," Mark said. He tried to sound casual. "I met Elena yesterday. She seemed very nice. I thought maybe she was away." Mr. Henderson stared at the mailbox for a moment. Then he looked back at Mark. "Miss Elena is a busy woman. Sometimes she forgets the small things. You should focus on your own apartment, Mark. There is a lot to do when you move into a new place." The manager turned and walked back into his office. He closed the door, and Mark heard the lock click. Mark stood in the lobby for a moment. He felt a cold chill despite the morning sun. He knew something was wrong, and it felt like the manager was trying to hide it. Mark decided to leave the lobby. He needed to go to his office and start his work. He walked through the glass doors and felt the warm air of the street. However, he did not feel relaxed. He felt like the building was a giant box full of dark secrets. He walked to the corner of the street and waited for the bus. He looked back at the Silver Oak apartments. From the outside, it looked like a normal, expensive building. He spent the morning at his office, but he could not think about travel articles. He thought about the yellow flower on the keychain in his pocket. He thought about the heavy sound from the night before. His boss asked him a question about a story, but Mark did not hear him. His mind was back in the quiet hallway of the 3rd floor. At lunchtime, Mark decided to go back to the apartment. He told his boss he felt a little sick. He wanted to check on Elena again. He wanted to see if she returned home. When he arrived at the building, he did not see Mr. Henderson in the lobby. The small office was dark and the door was closed. Mark walked toward the mailboxes. He wanted to see if the mail was still there. As he moved closer, he saw a man standing in front of the wall of silver boxes. This man was not a tenant. Mark did not recognize him. The man was very tall and wore a long, grey coat. He had short, dark hair and very pale skin. The man was not checking his own mail. He was holding a small notebook and a pen. He was looking at the names on the mailboxes very carefully. Mark stopped walking and stayed near a large plant in the corner. He watched the man. The stranger moved his finger across the metal boxes. He stopped at mailbox 4B. He looked at the name Elena and wrote something in his notebook. The man in the grey coat looked around the lobby. His eyes were quick and sharp. Mark stayed very still behind the green leaves of the plant. The man did not see him. The stranger then looked at mailbox 3B. Mark's mailbox. He wrote another note in his book. Mark felt a sudden flash of fear. Why was a stranger writing down his name? The man put his notebook into his coat pocket. He walked toward the front doors with long, fast steps. As he passed the glass, The sun hit his face. He looked tired and very serious. He pushed the heavy doors open and walked out into the busy street. Mark ran to the door and looked out. He saw the grey coat moving through the crowd of people. In a few seconds, the man was gone. Mark stood alone in the bright lobby. He felt very small and very confused. He now had two mysteries. Who was the man in the grey coat? And what did he want with Elena and Mark? He touched the keys in his pocket. They felt heavy, like a warning. He knew he had to go back upstairs, but he was afraid of what he might find. Mark stood at the elevator. His heart was beating fast. He wanted to go to his apartment, but he knew he had to go to the 4th floor first. He had Elena's keys in his pocket. He also had a lot of questions. He pressed the button for the 4th floor. The elevator moved slowly. When it stopped, Mark took a deep breath. The hallway was empty. It was very silent. Mark walked to apartment 4B. He looked at the door. It was exactly as he left it this morning. There was still a very small gap. The door was not locked. Mark felt a cold sweat on his forehead. This was not right. Nobody leaves their door open in a big city. Elena. He called again. He spoke louder this time. It is Mark, from downstairs. I have your keys. There was no sound from inside. Mark waited for 10 seconds. Then, he reached out and pushed the door with one finger. The door moved slowly and quietly. It opened into a small, dark hallway. The air inside the apartment smelled like sweet perfume and old coffee. Mark stepped inside. Hello. Is anyone home? He was in the living room now. It was a very pretty room. There was a blue sofa and a white rug. On the coffee table, there was a glass vase with a single yellow flower. The flower was dead now. Its petals were brown and dry. Next to the vase was a shopping bag. Inside the bag, Mark saw a carton of milk and a loaf of bread. The milk was sitting in a small pool of water. It was warm. It had been there for a long time. Mark looked around the room. Everything looked normal, but something felt wrong. The heavy sound from the night before happened here. He looked at the floor near the window. He saw a small scratch on the dark wood. It looked new. He walked toward the kitchen. On the table, he saw a cup of tea. It was half full, but the surface was dusty. Elena was here. And then she stopped whatever she was doing. She did not finish her tea. She did not put her groceries in the fridge. She just disappeared. Suddenly, Mark heard a sound. It was not coming from inside the apartment. It was coming from the hallway outside. It was the sound of heavy footsteps. Someone was walking toward apartment 4B. The footsteps were slow and steady. Mark panicked. He did not want anyone to find him inside Elena's home. He looked for a place to hide. He saw a large wooden wardrobe in the corner of the living room. He ran to it and stepped inside, pulling the heavy doors closed. He stayed very still in the darkness. Through a small crack in the wood, he watched the front door of the apartment. The door opened wider. A shadow fell across the floor. Someone was entering the room. Mark held his breath. He was pressed against the cold wood of the wardrobe. Through the tiny crack in the door, he watched a pair of black, polished shoes walk across the living room. The person stopped near the coffee table where the dead yellow flower sat. Mark looked up and saw Mr. Henderson. The manager looked different now. He was not smiling. He looked angry and worried. He looked at the grocery bag with the warm milk. He picked up the carton of milk and walked to the kitchen. Then, the manager walked back into the living room. He stood in the center of the room and looked around slowly. He looked at the wardrobe. Mark felt his heart stop. He stayed perfectly still. After a long minute, Mr. Henderson turned and walked toward the front door. He left the apartment and closed the door firmly. Mark heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. He was now trapped inside Elena's apartment. Mark waited for 5 minutes. He wanted to be sure the manager was gone. He pushed the wardrobe doors open and stepped out. The room felt even more silent than before. He went to the front door and pulled the handle. It was locked from the outside. "I need to find a way out," Mark whispered. He looked around the room for a spare key or another exit. He walked over to a small wooden desk near the window. There was a lamp on the desk and a few pens. On the floor next to the desk, he saw many small pieces of white paper. They looked like they were thrown there in a hurry. Mark knelt down and picked up the pieces. He put them on the top of the desk. It was like a puzzle. He began to move the pieces together. He saw a face. Then he saw a hand. Slowly, a picture started to form. It was a photograph of two people. One person was Elena. She looked very happy in the photo. She was standing in front of a large fountain. Next to her was a man. He was tall and had a kind smile. Mark looked closer at the man's face. He felt a shock of surprise. It was the man in the grey coat from the lobby. In the photograph, the man was not wearing a long coat. He was wearing a simple blue shirt. He had his arm around Elena. They looked like they were a couple or very close friends. But the photo was not just torn. It was ripped with a lot of anger. There were deep marks on the man's face in the picture, as if someone used a pen to scratch his eyes out. Mark looked at the torn photo and then at the locked door. Who ripped this photo? Was it Elena, or was it the person who made the heavy sound last night? He took the pieces of the photo and put them in his pocket. He had to get out of this apartment before the manager came back. Mark stood behind the locked door of apartment 4B. He felt like a prisoner. He looked at the door handle and then at the keys in his pocket. He forgot he had them. He took out the silver ring with the yellow flower. He tried the first key. It did not turn. He tried the second key. It fit perfectly. He turned it, and the lock made a sharp, metallic sound. The door was open. Mark stepped into the hallway. He moved very quietly. He did not want to see Mr. Henderson again in the hall. He went to the elevator and traveled down to the lobby. He needed to speak to the manager. He wanted to see if the manager would lie to him. Mr. Henderson was sitting in his small office. The door was open. He was looking at a computer screen. When Mark walked to the door, the manager looked up. He did not look happy to see Mark. "Hello, Mark," Mr. Henderson said. His voice was very dry. "I thought you were at work. I came back because I am worried," Mark said. He stood in the doorway. He did not sit down. "I heard a very loud sound from Elena's apartment last night. It sounded like something heavy fell. I went to her door today, but she did not answer." Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair. He put his hands together on the desk. "Miss Elena is fine, Mark. She called me this morning. She decided to go on a short trip. She is visiting some friends in the countryside." Mark felt a cold feeling in his chest. He knew this was a lie. He saw the warm milk in the sink and the dead flour on the table. People do not go on a trip and leave fresh groceries on the coffee table. "A trip?" Mark asked. He tried to keep his voice calm. "That is strange. Her mailbox is very full. And when I passed her door earlier, it was open. I saw her groceries on the table. The milk was spoiled." The manager's expression changed. His face became very stiff. He stood up slowly. He was taller than Mark, and he tried to look scary. "You should not be looking into other people's apartments, Mark," Mr. Henderson said. "In this building, we respect privacy. I told you that when you moved in. Elena is away. That is the end of the story." "But what about the noise?" Mark asked. "The building is old." The manager replied quickly. "Sometimes the pipes make noise. Sometimes the floors move. It is nothing. Go back to your apartment and finish your unpacking. Do not worry about Miss Elena anymore." Mark looked at the manager's eyes. They were hard and dark. Mark knew he could not ask more questions now. It was dangerous. He turned around and walked away. As he walked toward the elevator, he felt the manager's eyes on his back. Mark realized that Mr. Henderson was not just a manager. He was a man with something to hide. Mark walked back to his apartment on the 3rd floor. His hands were shaking slightly. He did not like the way Mr. Henderson looked at him. The manager was lying, and Mark knew it. He entered apartment 3B and closed the door. He turned the lock and leaned his back against the wood. He felt a little safer inside his own walls, but the silence of the building now felt heavy and cold. He walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. He looked at the boxes he still had to unpack. He did not feel like moving books or clothes anymore. He felt like he was in the middle of a bad dream. He thought about Elena and the man in the grey coat. Were they friends? Why was the man's face scratched out of the photo? Mark went back to the living room. As he walked past the front door, he noticed something on the floor. It was a small, white piece of paper. It was folded into a tiny square. It was not there when he entered the apartment a few minutes ago. Someone must have pushed it under the door while he was in the kitchen. Mark felt a sudden chill. He looked at the door. He did not hear any footsteps in the hallway. He did not hear the elevator. Whoever put the note there was very quiet. They were like a ghost. He picked up the paper with trembling fingers. He unfolded it slowly. The paper was cheap and thin. On the inside, there were only 4 words. They were written in big, dark capital letters. "Do not ask questions." Mark stared at the words. His heart was beating very fast. This was a warning. Someone in the Silver Oak apartments was watching him. Someone knew he was talking to Mr. Henderson. Someone knew he was looking for Elena. He sat down on his sofa and looked at the note. Was it from the manager? Or was it from the man in the grey coat? Perhaps it was from another neighbor he had not met yet. Mark looked around his living room. For the first time, he did not feel alone in his apartment. He felt like eyes were on him from the corners of the room. He looked at the ceiling, thinking about the empty apartment 4B above him. He took the torn pieces of the photograph out of his pocket. He laid them on the coffee table next to the secret note. He had the keys, the photo, and now this warning. He was no longer just a new tenant. He was part of a mystery he did not understand. "I cannot stop now," Mark whispered to the empty room. "Elena is in trouble. I know it." He decided to keep the note. He put it inside one of his books on the shelf. He wanted to hide it. He stayed away from the windows and kept the lights low. He waited for the night to come, wondering what would happen next in this quiet, dangerous building. Mark looked at the 4 words on the paper again. The ink was dark and the letters were large. They looked angry. He felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. This was a direct threat. Someone was watching his every move. He wondered how they knew he was asking questions. Was it Mr. Henderson? Or was it the man in the grey coat? Perhaps there was someone else in the building he had not met yet. He walked to the front door and checked the lock one more time. It was secure. Then, he went to the large window in the living room. He looked down at the street. People were walking home from work. They looked happy and normal. They were talking on their phones or carrying bags of food. Mark did not feel normal. He felt like a target in a dangerous game. He sat on his bed and tried to think clearly. He had Elena's keys in his pocket. He had the torn photo of the man and Elena on his table. Now, he had this warning note. He was not a detective. He was a travel writer. He usually wrote about beautiful beaches and old cathedrals. But this was a real mystery, and it was happening in his own home. Suddenly, he heard a very soft sound in the hallway. It was like the sound of a shoe touching the carpet very lightly. Mark stood up quickly. He did not turn on the lights. He walked to his front door on his toes. He did not make any noise. He put his eye to the small peephole in the door. The hallway was long and dim. The blue carpet looked almost black in the shadows. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he saw a shape near the elevator. It was a tall shadow. The shadow did not move for a long time. It stood perfectly still near the wall. Mark held his breath. He felt his heart hitting his chest. Then, the shadow moved. It walked away from the elevator and went into the stairwell. Mark did not see a face. He only saw the movement of a long coat. He went back to his desk and sat down in the dark. He could not sleep. He needed to find out more about Elena. If she was truly on a trip, where did she go? Why did she leave her keys on the floor? Mark realized he was in danger, but he could not leave Elena behind. She was the only person who was kind to him since he arrived in the city. He decided to stay awake. He would watch the hallway from behind his door. He would see who came and went in the middle of the night. The Silver Oak apartments were not a peaceful home anymore. They were a place full of lies and shadows. Mark realized that he was now a part of the secret. The morning sun was bright, but Mark felt very tired. He had stayed awake for most of the night, watching the door. He eventually fell asleep on the sofa. When he woke up, his neck was sore and his head hurt. He went to the kitchen and made a very strong cup of coffee. He needed to be alert. He decided to go back to the 4th floor. He wanted to see if anyone was in Elena's apartment. As he waited for the elevator, he heard the sound of the metal doors opening upstairs. He decided to take the stairs instead. He moved quietly up the stone steps. When he reached the 4th floor, he stayed behind the heavy door and looked through the small glass window. A woman was standing in front of apartment 4B. She was not Elena. This woman was tall and very thin. She was dressed completely in black. She wore a long black coat, black shoes, and a wide black hat that partially hid her face. She looked very elegant but also very sad. She was holding a large black handbag tightly against her side. She was not knocking on the door. Instead, she was looking at the lock. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small silver key. She put the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a smooth movement. Mark pushed the stairwell door open and walked into the hallway. "Excuse me," he said loudly. The woman jumped. She turned around quickly. Her face was pale, and her eyes were a very light blue. She looked surprised and a little bit angry. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was sharp and clear. "I am Mark. I live in 3B, right below this apartment." Mark explained. He walked closer to her. "I am a friend of Elena. I was worried because I haven't seen her lately." The woman relaxed a little, but she did not smile. She stood in the doorway of the apartment. "I am Sarah," she said. "I am Elena's sister. She called me and asked me to come here." "Elena called you?" Mark asked. He felt a bit of hope. "Is she okay? Where is she?" Sarah looked into the apartment. The living room was still dark. "She is fine. She is just taking a break. She is staying at a quiet hotel in the mountains. She forgot some of her things, and she asked me to come and get them for her." Mark looked at Sarah's eyes. They were cold. He remembered the dead flower and the warm milk in the sink. If Elena called her sister, Why didn't she mention the groceries? Why didn't she tell her sister to throw away the milk? I met Elena 2 days ago, Mark said. She seemed very happy to be here. It is strange that she left so suddenly. Elena is a very spontaneous person, Sarah replied. She stepped inside the apartment and began to close the door. She changes her mind often. Thank you for your concern, Mark. But everything is under control. Have a nice day. The door closed firmly. Mark stood in the hallway alone. He did not believe Sarah. She did not look like Elena. She did not act like a worried sister. She acted like someone who had a job to do. Mark reached into his pocket and felt the keys he found on the floor. If Sarah was Elena's sister, why did she have her own key? And why did Elena drop her keys in the hall? Nothing Sarah said made sense. Mark did not go back to the elevator immediately. He stood in the hallway and stared at the dark wood of Elena's door. Sarah's words moved through his mind like a cold wind. She said Elena was spontaneous. She said Elena went to the mountains for a break. But Mark knew that happy, spontaneous people did not buy a fresh loaf of bread and a carton of milk 5 minutes before leaving for a long trip. They did not leave their front door unlocked and their keys on the floor. Mark walked slowly back to his own apartment. He entered 3B and sat at his desk. He took the pieces of the torn photograph out of his pocket and looked at them again. Elena looked so happy with the man in the grey coat. If she was in the mountains, why was her sister here now? And why did Sarah look so different from Elena? Elena had a warm, round face and soft brown hair. Sarah was sharp, thin, and had eyes like ice. He heard a noise from above. It was the sound of a heavy drawer opening in Elena's bedroom. Then, he heard the sound of something metal hitting the floor. It was a sharp, clear sound. Sarah was not just getting a few things. She was searching the apartment. She was looking for something specific. Mark stood on his chair. He put his ear against the white ceiling. He listened carefully. He heard the sound of footsteps moving quickly from the bedroom to the living room. Then, he heard the sound of paper ripping. Was she destroying more photographs? Was she looking for the note that told Mark not to ask questions? She is not her sister. Mark whispered to himself. She is looking for something Elena hid. Mark felt a wave of fear, but he also felt a wave of anger. This was his home now, and he did not like being lied to. He thought about the man in the grey coat. Was that man also looking for what Sarah wanted? He looked at the note he had hidden in his book. Do not ask questions. He realized that Sarah and Mr. Henderson were likely working together. Mr. Henderson said Elena was in the countryside. Sarah said she was in the mountains. Their stories were similar, but not the same. They were both trying to make Mark stop looking. Mark decided he needed to be more careful. If they knew he was suspicious, he might be in danger. He looked around his room. He needed to find a way to see what was happening without being seen. He remembered the old ventilation grates in the kitchen and the bathroom. Maybe he could hear more through the pipes. He moved to the kitchen and looked up at the small metal square on the wall. He was determined to find the truth, no matter what Sarah or the manager said. Mark decided to leave the 3rd floor. He felt that the answers were not only in the apartments above. He wanted to see the parts of the building that people did not visit often. He went to the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. The elevator moved down further than the lobby. When the doors opened, the air was cold. It smelled like wet concrete, old paper, and dust. The basement was a maze of shadows. There were many small storage rooms with wire walls. These were for the tenants to keep their extra boxes and suitcases. Mark walked past them slowly. The pipes on the ceiling were thick and covered in white dust. He saw old bicycles, winter coats, and large plastic bins. Every storage unit had a number. He found the one for apartment 3B, but it was empty. He then looked for unit 4B. Elena's storage unit was full of boxes. They were stacked high and looked very organized. Mark looked through the wire wall. He saw a set of winter tires and some old paintings wrapped in brown paper. There was no sign of a struggle here. But as he walked further into the back of the basement, the lights became dimmer. One light bulb was flickering on and off, making the shadows move across the floor. At the very end of the long hallway, there was a door. It was not like the other storage units. It was a heavy door made of thick, grey metal. It did not have a window or a wire wall. It looked very strong and very old. There was no number on this door, and no name. It stood there like a silent guard in the dark. Mark walked up to the metal door. He looked at the floor and saw fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had been here very recently. The footprints led straight to the door and stopped. Mark reached out his hand. He grabbed the cold metal handle and tried to turn it. It did not move. It was locked with a very large, heavy lock. He noticed small scratches around the keyhole, as if someone had been using a key there many times. He put his ear against the cold metal. At first, he heard nothing. Then, he heard a very low, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of a machine working. Or perhaps it was something else. He couldn't be sure. The sound was deep and steady. As he stood there, he felt a small draft of air coming from under the door. The air smelled strange. It did not smell like dust. It smelled like fresh paint and something metallic. Suddenly, Mark heard the elevator doors open at the other end of the basement. He froze. He did not want to be found in the back of the basement. He looked for a place to hide. There was a large wooden crate near the metal door. He quickly stepped behind it and waited. He saw a pair of black boots walking across the concrete floor. The person was walking toward the metal door. Mark stayed very still and held his breath. He realized that this door was the most important secret in the Silver Oak apartments. Mark pressed his back against the rough wood of the crate. He stayed in the deepest shadow he could find. The footsteps on the concrete floor stopped right in front of the heavy metal door. Mark heard the jingling of keys, a sound he was becoming very familiar with in this building. A key turned in the lock, and the heavy door creaked open. Mark peered through a small gap between two wooden boards. He expected to see Mr. Henderson. Instead, he saw the tall man in the long, grey coat. The man looked even more serious in the dim basement light. He did not go inside the room immediately. He stood in the doorway and looked back down the hallway, checking to see if he was alone. Mark pulled his head back, hiding his face. The man stepped into the room and closed the door. Mark heard the lock click again. The basement returned to its heavy silence. Mark waited for a few minutes. His heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew he should leave, but he needed to know what was inside that room. He crept out from behind the crate and walked to the metal door on his tiptoes. He put his ear against the cold surface. The rhythmic machine sound was louder now. He also heard the man's voice. The man was speaking to someone, but his voice was very low. Mark could not understand the words. Then, he heard a second voice. It was deep and rough. "Is the car ready?" The second voice asked. "Yes." The man in the grey coat replied. "At 11 o'clock. In the back parking lot. We must be fast. The new neighbor is asking too many questions." Mark felt a cold wave of fear. They were talking about him. He realized he was in much more danger than he thought. He needed to get out of the basement before the men came out. He turned and ran toward the elevator as quietly as possible. He didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs, climbing 2 steps at a time until he reached the lobby. He stopped at the lobby door to catch his breath. He looked through the glass. Outside, the sun was setting, turning the sky a dark orange. He saw Mr. Henderson standing by the front doors, looking out at the parking lot. Mark realized the manager and the man in the grey coat were definitely working together. He felt like the walls of the Silver Oak apartments were closing in on him. He had to stay until 11 o'clock. He had to see what, or who, they were putting in that car. Mark reached the 4th floor. His legs felt heavy from running up the stairs. He stood in the hallway for a moment to calm his breathing. He knew he was taking a big risk, but he had to see Sarah again. He needed to know if she was really Elena's sister, or part of the plan he heard about in the basement. He walked to apartment 4B and knocked on the door. He waited. For a few seconds, there was no sound. Then, he heard the lock turn. Sarah opened the door. She was still wearing her black dress, but she looked tired now. Her hair was messy, and her eyes looked sharp and angry. "You again," she said. She did not open the door wide. "I told you that Elena is fine. Why are you here?" "I'm sorry to bother you," Mark said. He tried to look like a normal, worried neighbor. "I forgot to tell you something. I found Elena's keys in the hallway yesterday. I wanted to give them to you." Sarah looked at his hand. Mark pulled the keys with the yellow flower from his pocket. Sarah's expression changed for a split second. She looked surprised. Then she quickly reached out and took them. "Thank you," she said. "I will give them to her." As she took the keys, the door opened a little wider. Mark looked past her into the living room. The apartment looked different than it did earlier that morning. The coffee table was moved to the side. In the middle of the room, a large blue vase lay on the floor. It was broken into many small, sharp pieces. Mark also noticed something else. On the white rug near the broken glass, there was a large stain. It was dark red. It looked wet. Mark felt a sudden coldness in his chest. "Is everything okay?" he asked, pointing toward the floor. "I heard a loud sound earlier. Did something break?" Sarah stepped in front of the view, trying to hide the room with her body. "It was an accident," she said quickly. Her voice was cold and hard. "I dropped the vase while I was cleaning. The red stain is just some juice I spilled. It is nothing for you to worry about." "That is a lot of juice," Mark said softly. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She looked like she wanted to scream at him. "It is a big apartment and I am very busy, Mark. I don't have time for more questions. Please go back to your room." She closed the door before he could say another word. Mark stood in the quiet hallway. He didn't believe her for 1 second. The red stain didn't look like juice. It looked like blood. He remembered the heavy sound he heard on his first night. Maybe that was the sound of someone falling, not furniture moving. He walked back to the elevator. He looked at his watch. It was 7 o'clock. He had 4 hours before the meeting in the parking lot at 11 o'clock. He had to decide what to do. Should he go to the police, or should he wait and see what they put in the car? He felt like he was walking into a trap, but he couldn't leave Elena behind. Mark sat in his living room in total darkness. He did not want anyone to see him from the street. He did not want Mr. Henderson or Sarah to know he was awake. He looked at the glowing numbers on his digital clock. It was 8:30. The air in his apartment felt heavy and still. He sat very quietly on his sofa, listening to the building. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was a high, rhythmic sound coming from directly above him. It was a telephone ringing in Elena's apartment. The sound was muffled by the floor and the ceiling, but in the quiet night, it was very clear. Mark stayed still and listened. The phone rang 5 times. Then, it stopped. The silence returned, but only for a moment. 1 minute later, the phone started to ring again. It was the same steady, persistent sound. Mark counted the rings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Why isn't she answering? Mark whispered to himself. He knew Sarah was upstairs. He saw her enter the apartment only an hour ago. If she was Elena's sister and she was there to help, why did she let the phone ring and ring? A normal person would pick up the phone, especially if they were waiting for news about a family member. The phone stopped ringing again. Mark waited. 10 minutes passed. Then, the sound returned for a third time. This time, the ringing did not stop after 5 or 7 rings. It continued for a long time. It felt like the person on the other end was desperate to talk to someone. The sound was like a cry for help echoing through the walls of the Silver Oak apartments. Mark stood up and walked to the kitchen. He stood under the ventilation grate. He could hear the ringing more clearly here. It was a sharp, electronic sound. He waited, hoping to hear the sound of Sarah's footsteps or the sound of her voice answering the call. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No voice. Only the endless ringing of the phone. Finally, the ringing stopped. It was replaced by a heavy, thick silence. Mark felt a cold shiver go down his spine. He realized something important. Either Sarah was not in the apartment anymore, or she was sitting there in the dark, just like him, watching the phone and refusing to touch it. He looked at his watch again. It was almost 9 o'clock. 2 hours remained until the meeting in the parking lot. The mystery of the phone calls made him feel even more nervous. Who was calling? Was it Elena trying to reach her home? Or was it the man in the grey coat checking to see if anyone was inside? Mark felt like a small animal caught in a very large web. Every sound in the building felt like a warning, and the silent telephone was the loudest warning of all. Mark was still sitting in his dark living room. He looked at the clock again. It was 9:15. He was waiting for 11 o'clock, the time for the secret meeting in the parking lot. He felt like time was moving very slowly. Every minute felt like an hour. The apartment was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. Suddenly, he heard the sound of the elevator. The metal doors opened with a smooth motion. Mark stood up quickly and walked to his front door. He stayed in the shadows and looked through the peephole. In the dim light of the hallway, he saw 2 men. They were not wearing the uniforms of a famous delivery company. They wore plain blue shirts, dark trousers, and heavy work boots. They looked strong and very tired. They were moving a very large wooden crate. The crate was on a small cart with wheels. Even with the wheels, the men were struggling. Their faces were red, and their muscles were tight. The crate was very tall and very wide. It was made of thick, dark wood and closed with heavy metal nails. It looked like it weighed hundreds of pounds. "Be careful," the taller man said. His voice was a low growl. "This is very heavy. Do not let it hit the wall. If we break it, we will be in big trouble." The shorter man nodded. He was breathing very hard and wiping sweat from his forehead. "Why are we delivering this so late? It is almost the middle of the night. This is not a normal time for work." "Don't ask questions," the tall man replied. Mark felt a chill when he heard those words. They were the same words from the secret note under his door. "Mr. Henderson wants this delivered to apartment 4B tonight. He said it is for the woman who lives there. Our job is to leave it and go." The men pushed the crate down the hall. The wheels of the cart made a long, low sound on the blue carpet. They stopped in front of Elena's door. They used a metal tool to push the crate off the cart. It landed on the floor with a very loud, heavy sound that made the floor under Mark's feet shake. Mark worried that the floor might break. The men did not knock on Elena's door. They did not wait for Sarah or Elena to come out. They simply left the crate in the middle of the hallway, blocking part of the path. They put their cart back in the elevator and disappeared. Mark stayed at his door. He wanted to go outside and look at the crate. He wanted to see if there were any labels or names on the wood. He waited for a few minutes to be sure the men were gone. He slowly turned his lock and opened his door only a few inches. The hallway was empty and quiet again. The large wooden crate sat in front of Elena's door like a strange, dark monument. It looked cold and mysterious. Mark noticed a small white paper stuck to the side of the wood. He wanted to run out and read it, but he heard a door opening on the floor above. He quickly closed his door and locked it. He realized that the delivery was not a normal package. It was another piece of the dark puzzle. Mark looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He could not sit in his dark living room anymore. The large wooden crate was still sitting in the hallway outside Elena's door. He felt like he was losing his mind. He needed to do something. He remembered that the maintenance workers usually took the trash out to the back alley at this time. He decided to go to the back of the building. He did not use the main elevator. He used the small service stairs near the kitchen. He moved quietly down the steps until he reached the ground floor. He found a heavy grey door that led to the alley behind the Silver Oak apartments. The air outside was cold and smelled like rain. The alley was narrow and dark. There were 4 large, green metal trash bins against the stone wall. Mark walked toward them. He felt like a criminal, but he had to know the truth. He pulled the heavy lid of the first bin. It made a scraping sound against the metal. Mark stopped and waited, but nobody came. He began to look through the bags. Most of them were full of normal things like food wrappers and old newspapers. Then, he saw a small white bag. It was not closed tightly. He opened it and his heart skipped a beat. Inside the bag was a blue scarf. Mark recognized the scarf immediately. It was made of soft silk. Elena was wearing it the first time he met her. It was a beautiful, bright blue color. But now, the scarf was dirty. It was covered in gray dust and had a small tear in the middle. Why would Elena throw away such a nice scarf? If she was on a trip, she would take her favorite clothes with her. He searched further in the bag. He found a small piece of broken glass. It was blue. He realized it was a piece of the broken vase he saw in apartment 4B. There were also some paper towels with dark red stains on them. "This is not juice," Mark whispered. He touched the blue scarf. He felt a deep sadness. He was now certain that something terrible happened to Elena. Mr. Henderson and Sarah were cleaning the apartment and throwing away the evidence. They were trying to make it look like she just moved away, but they were being messy. He heard a car engine nearby. He quickly put the scarf in his jacket pocket and hid behind the large metal bins. A dark car drove slowly past the entrance of the alley. It did not have its lights on. It moved like a ghost through the shadows. Mark stayed very still. His hands were cold, and he was shaking. He had the scarf, the torn photo, and the keys. He had enough proof to know that Elena did not leave for the mountains. She was still here, or something happened to her in this building. He needed to get back inside and find a safe place to think. As he walked back to the service door, he felt like the windows of the building were eyes, watching him from the dark. Mark entered the building through the side service door. He kept the blue scarf hidden in his jacket pocket. It felt like a heavy weight against his side. He did not want to use the elevator anymore. He felt too trapped in that small metal box. Instead, he climbed the stairs slowly. He reached the 3rd floor and waited behind the heavy door. He listened for any voices or footsteps. The hallway was silent. He walked toward his apartment, 3B. He was ready to put his key in the lock, but he stopped. He felt a strange sensation, like a cold finger touching the back of his neck. He felt like someone was looking at him. He turned around quickly, but the hallway was empty. The long blue carpet stretched out toward the elevator. No one was there. Mark looked up at the ceiling. There was a small light fixture directly above his door. It was a simple glass bowl with a bulb inside. He looked at it every day, but tonight, something was different. One of the metal screws was loose. The glass bowl was tilted to one side. Mark stood on his tiptoes. He was a tall man, so he could see the top of the fixture. He saw a tiny, shiny object hidden in the shadow of the metal frame. It was no bigger than a shirt button. It had a very small, dark glass lens in the center. A tiny green light was blinking very slowly inside it. It was a camera. It was pointed directly at his front door. Mark felt a sudden wave of fear. His hands began to shake. This was not a security camera for the building. Those were large and easy to see in the lobby. This was a hidden camera. It was put there to watch him specifically. Whoever put it there wanted to see every time he left his room and every time he came back. They wanted to know if he was alone. He wanted to reach up and pull the camera down. He wanted to break it into 100 pieces. But then he remembered the note. Do not ask questions. If he destroyed the camera, the people watching would know he found it. They would know he was a threat to their secrets. He forced himself to stay calm. He turned his key in the lock and acted like a normal, tired man. He entered his apartment and closed the door quietly. He did not turn on the living room lights. He walked to the kitchen and stood in the dark. He looked at his watch. It was 10:30. The meeting in the parking lot was only 30 minutes away. He realized that the Silver Oak apartments were not just a building of secrets. They were a prison. Every move he made was being recorded. He had the blue scarf, the keys, and the torn photo, but he was being watched by a hidden eye. He needed to find a way to leave the building at 11 o'clock without the camera seeing him. He had to be smarter than the people behind the lens. Mark sat on the floor of his dark kitchen. He was careful to stay away from the windows. He did not turn on any lights. The only light in the room came from the small green numbers on his oven clock. It was 10:40 p.m. He knew the hidden camera was outside his door, watching the hallway. He felt like he was being hunted in his own home. He realized he could not leave through the front door. If he walked out at 11 p.m. to go to the parking lot, the person watching the camera would see him. They would know he was following them. He needed a plan. But first, he wanted to see who was watching the camera. He moved slowly toward his front door. He did not stand up. He crawled on his hands and knees so he was below the level of the peephole. When he reached the door, he rose up very slowly. He put his eye to the small glass hole. The hallway was dim. The blue carpet looked like a dark river. He looked at the light fixture above his door. He could not see the tiny camera from this side, but he knew it was there. He waited. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. His legs began to hurt from standing so still, but he did not move. At 10:55 p.m., the elevator at the end of the hall opened. Mark heard the soft movement of the doors. A person stepped out. It was a man, but it was not Mr. Henderson or the man in the grey coat. This man was wearing a dark blue uniform. He looked like a maintenance worker, but he did not have a tool bag. He walked quickly and quietly down the hall. The man stopped directly in front of Mark's door. Mark held his breath. He was so close he could almost hear the man's heart beating. The man reached up to the light fixture. Mark heard the dry sound of a hand touching the glass bowl. The man moved the glass slightly. He was checking the camera. The man pulled a small silver device from his pocket. It looked like a phone. He looked at the screen for a few seconds. He seemed happy with what he saw. Then, he tapped the side of the light fixture and turned around. He did not knock on the door. He did not look at the peephole. He walked back to the elevator and disappeared. Mark waited until he heard the elevator move away. He looked at the clock. It was exactly 11 p.m. This was the time for the meeting in the parking lot. He knew he had to get there. But the front door was not an option. The camera was active and the maintenance man was likely watching the video right now. He remembered the small service stairs he used before. They were at the back of the kitchen, near the small laundry room. He hurried back to the kitchen. He moved through the darkness like a shadow. He opened the small service door. It led to a narrow, dark staircase used by the workers. There were no cameras here. Mark began to descend the stairs, moving as fast as he could. He had to reach the parking lot before the blue car arrived. His heart was racing. The night watch was over, and the hunt was beginning. Mark moved down the service stairs as fast as he could. He reached the bottom floor and opened a heavy metal door. He was now in the back parking lot of the Silver Oak Apartments. The air was cold and damp. The only light came from a few yellow lamps high up on the brick walls. The parking lot was filled with expensive cars, all sitting silently in the dark. Mark hid behind a large concrete pillar. He looked at his watch. It was exactly 11 p.m. He waited. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, he heard the low hum of an engine. A car was approaching from the street. It did not have its headlights on. It moved slowly into the lot, like a dark fish moving through deep water. The car was a dark blue sedan. It was clean and shiny, even in the dim light. It drove to the very back of the lot, near the entrance to the basement. It stopped there and the engine turned off. The lot became very silent again. Mark watched from behind the pillar. The car doors did not open immediately. After a minute, the back door of the building opened. Two men walked out. One was Mr. Henderson. He was wearing a heavy jacket over his suit. The other was the man in the grey coat. They walked toward the blue car. They were not talking. They looked very serious. The driver of the blue car stepped out. He was a short man with a very round face and no hair. He was wearing a leather jacket. He walked to the back of the car and opened the trunk. He looked at Mr. Henderson and nodded. "Is it ready?" the driver asked. His voice was quiet, but Mark could hear it because the lot was so still. "We are moving it now," Mr. Henderson replied. "The maintenance man is checking the hallways. The new neighbor is in his room. He is not a problem." The man in the grey coat looked around the parking lot. His eyes moved across the cars and the pillars. Mark pulled his head back and pressed his body against the cold concrete. He felt his heart beating in his ears. He hoped the man did not see him. "Be quick," the driver said. "I cannot stay here for long. The police often drive past this street at midnight." Mr. Henderson and the man in the grey coat turned and went back into the building. The driver stayed by the car. He took a cigarette from his pocket but did not light it. He stood there, watching the door. Mark realized that something was about to come out of the basement. Was it the large wooden crate? Or was it something else? He knew he had to stay and watch, but he was afraid. If they found him here, he would have no place to hide. He looked at the blue car and then at the dark door of the building. He felt like he was watching a crime happen, and he was the only witness. Mark stayed behind the pillar until the men returned. They were carrying a long, heavy bag. It was made of black plastic and looked very full. They put it inside the trunk of the blue car. The driver closed the trunk and drove away quickly. Mr. Henderson and the man in the grey coat went back inside. Mark waited for 5 minutes. Then he hurried back to the service stairs. He needed to get to his floor, but he felt too nervous to go straight to 3B. He stopped at the second floor to catch his breath. The second floor was different from his floor. The hallway had several small paintings on the walls. As Mark walked toward the stairs, he saw a door open. Apartment 2A was not like the other apartments. It was full of bright lights and the smell of oil paint. A man was standing in the doorway. He was about 40 years old. He had messy hair and paint stains on his old blue shirt. "You look like you saw a ghost," the man said. His voice was soft and very calm. "I'm just tired," Mark replied. He tried to hide his shaking hands. "I am Mark. I live in 3B. "I am David," the man said. He stepped back and pointed into his room. "I am an artist. I spend my days painting this building. Would you like to come in for a minute? You look like you need to sit down." Mark hesitated. Then he entered. The apartment was one big room. There were dozens of paintings against the walls. Most of them were pictures of the Silver Oak apartments. David painted the stairs, the lobby, and the long hallways. Mark looked at a painting of the front door. It looked very real, but it also looked a bit sad. "I see everything in this building," David said. He picked up a brush and began to clean it with a cloth. "I sit by my window and I watch the world go by. It is a very strange place, Mark. People come and go, but nobody ever really talks." "Did you know Elena from 4B?" Mark asked. David stopped cleaning his brush. He looked at Mark with very serious eyes. "Yes. I painted her once. She was a very kind woman. She liked the colors I used. But I haven't seen her for 3 days. Her lights are usually on at night, but now her windows are dark." "The manager says she is on a trip," Mark said. David laughed, but he did not look happy. "Mr. Henderson says a lot of things. He is a man who loves silence more than the truth. I see things from my window, Mark. I saw a man in a gray coat. I saw a woman in black. This building is like a play, and everyone is wearing a mask." Mark felt a small sense of relief. Finally, someone else noticed that things were wrong. He looked at a large painting in the corner of the room. It was a picture of the building at night. David was a good artist. He captured the shadows perfectly. Mark realized that David might be his only friend in this dangerous place. He decided to trust him, but he did not tell him about the blue car yet. He wanted to see what else David knew first. Mark walked closer to the large painting David was working on. It was a wide view of the Silver Oak apartments from the street at night. The windows were small squares of yellow and black. David's style was very detailed. You could see the curtains in the windows and the small cracks in the stone walls. "You have a lot of talent, David," Mark said. He was trying to find his apartment in the painting. He found the 3rd floor and then looked up to the 4th. David stood next to him. He was holding a palette of dark colors. "I try to paint what I see, not what I feel. But sometimes, the painting tells me things I didn't notice before." Mark pointed to apartment 4B in the painting. In the picture, the window was not dark. There was a faint, blue light coming from behind the curtains. But that wasn't the most interesting part. Mark leaned in closer. In the small painted window, there was a shape. It was the shape of a person's head and shoulders. The person was looking out through a small gap in the curtains. "Is that Elena?" Mark asked. He felt a chill. David shook his head. "I painted that yesterday evening. I was sitting across the street. I saw the curtain move. I saw someone watching the street. But it wasn't Elena. Elena is shorter. This person was taller, with very broad shoulders." Mark looked at the shape again. It reminded him of the man in the gray coat. "When did you see this exactly?" "It was just before the sun went down," David replied. "About 6 o'clock. Whoever is in that room doesn't want to be seen. They stay in the shadows. They only look out when they think the street is empty." Mark thought about Sarah, the sister. She was thin and tall, but not broad-shouldered. The man in the gray coat fit the description much better. If the man in the gray coat was staying in Elena's apartment, then where was Elena? "There is something else," David said. He pointed to the bottom of the painting, near the basement entrance. He had painted a small, black car near the door. "That car comes every night. Different people get in and out, but the car is always the same. And they always carry those heavy black bags." Mark felt his pulse quicken. "I saw those bags tonight, David. They put them in a blue car at 11 o'clock. David turned to look at Mark. His face was very pale. "If you saw the bags, then you are in more danger than I thought. Mr. Henderson does not like witnesses. He thinks he owns this building and everyone inside it." Mark looked at the painting one last time. The person in the window felt like a ghost watching him. He realized that David's art was not just beautiful. It was a record of everything the manager wanted to hide. He knew he had to go back to his room, but the secret in the painting made him feel like someone was already waiting for him in the dark. Mark left David's apartment and went back to the 3rd floor. He was very careful. He remembered the hidden camera above his door. He walked past it with his head down. He entered his room and locked the door. He could not sleep. He thought about the red stain on the rug and the person in David's painting. The next morning, Mark decided to be brave. He did not want to hide anymore. He went up to the 4th floor and knocked loudly on Elena's door. He did not wait. He knocked again. The door opened. Sarah stood there. She looked very tired. Her black dress was wrinkled. She did not look elegant today. She looked like she had not slept at all. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked. Her voice was like ice. "I saw the rug yesterday, Sarah," Mark said. He stood very tall. "I saw the red stain. I also found Elena's blue scarf in the trash. It was torn and dirty. You told me she was in the mountains, but people do not throw away their favorite clothes before a trip." Sarah's face went white. She tried to close the door, but Mark put his foot in the way. He was not afraid of her anymore. "Where is Elena?" Mark asked loudly. "I saw the men moving heavy bags last night. I saw the blue car. I know something is happening in this building." Sarah looked down the hallway to see if anyone was watching. She grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him inside the apartment. She closed the door quickly. She looked at him with wide, scared eyes. "Be quiet," she whispered. "Do you want to get us both killed? You have no idea what you are talking about. Then tell me the truth," Mark said. He looked at the white rug. The red stain was gone. Someone had cleaned it with very strong soap. The room smelled like chemicals. "I am not her sister," Sarah said. Her voice was shaking. "I am a private investigator. Elena hired me a week ago. She was afraid of Mr. Henderson. She thought he was using the building for something illegal." Mark was shocked. "If you are an investigator, why did you lie to me?" "Because I didn't know who you were," Sarah replied. She walked to the window and looked through the curtains. "Mr. Henderson has eyes everywhere. He has cameras and he has the maintenance men. I had to act like I was part of the family so I could get into this room." "Is she alive?" Mark asked. His voice was a whisper. Sarah turned back to him. There were tears in her eyes. "I don't know. I found the broken vase and the blood on the rug when I arrived. I think they took her. That heavy sound you heard on your first night. That was the struggle, Mark. That was the moment they caught her." Mark felt a wave of horror. He looked around the pretty living room. It was not a home anymore. It was a crime scene. He realized that Sarah was not the enemy. She was just as trapped as he was. Mark and Sarah stood in the middle of the quiet apartment. The air felt thin. Now that the truth was out, the danger felt much closer. Sarah's hands were still shaking as she held the edge of the table. if you are an investigator. Mark said, trying to stay calm. You must have a plan. We can't just wait here. Sarah shook her head. My plan was to find Elena's documents. She told me she had proof that Henderson was moving stolen goods through the basement. But the apartment is empty. They cleaned everything. Mark remembered the heavy metal door in the basement. He remembered the rhythmic sound of machines and the smell of fresh paint. The proof isn't here. Mark said, it is in the basement. There is a room at the end of the hall. I saw the man in the grey coat enter it. We need a key. Sarah said. Henderson keeps the master keys in the maintenance office near the lobby. But he is always there. Not always. Mark replied. He does his rounds at 10 o'clock every morning. That is in 5 minutes. They decided to move quickly. They took the stairs down to the ground floor. They stayed behind the heavy door of the stairwell and watched the lobby. Exactly at 10 o'clock. Mr. Henderson stepped out of his office. He looked at his watch, adjusted his dark suit, and walked toward the elevator. Once the elevator doors closed, Mark and Sarah ran to the office. The door was closed, but it was not locked. They stepped inside. The room was small and smelled like old paper and cigarettes. On the wall, there was a large wooden board with dozens of silver keys hanging on hooks. Each hook had a number. Mark looked for 4B, then for the basement. But one hook was different. It did not have a number. It was labeled MR for maintenance room. This must be it. Mark whispered. He reached for the key, but his hand stopped. Next to the keys, there was a small television screen. It was divided into 4 squares. Mark saw the lobby, the third-floor hallway, the parking lot, and the basement. In the third-floor square, he saw his own front door. He saw the hidden camera was working perfectly. He is watching everything. Sarah whispered, her face pale in the light of the screen. Suddenly, the screen showing the elevator changed. The doors opened on the second floor. Mr. Henderson did not go to the top floor. He was getting out early. He was walking toward the stairs. He's coming back. Mark said. He grabbed the MR key from the hook. They could not go out the front door of the office. They would walk right into him. Mark looked around the small room and saw a tiny window above the desk. It led to the back alley. Quick. Through here. Mark helped Sarah climb onto the desk. She pushed the window open and crawled through. Mark followed her just as he heard the office door handle turn. He dropped into the cold, damp alley and closed the window behind him. They had the key, but they had very little time. The cold air of the alleyway hit Mark's face, but he didn't feel the chill. His adrenaline was surging. He and Sarah stood pressed against the brick wall, listening to the muffled sounds from inside the office. A few seconds later, the office window vibrated. Henderson had likely slammed the door or dropped into his chair. We have to move. Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the morning air. He'll check that keyboard eventually. He's a perfectionist. They didn't go back through the lobby. Instead, they hurried to the heavy metal service door Mark had used the night before. Mark used his shoulder to push it open, the hinges giving a soft, oily protest. They were back in the stairwell, the silence of the building feeling more like a trap than a comfort. They descended into the basement. The further down they went, the more the smell of damp concrete and old iron intensified. Mark led the way, his hand gripping the cold silver key marked MR. The door is at the very end. Mark murmured, past the storage units. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the flickering light bulb Mark had seen earlier was now completely dead. They navigated by the faint glow of the exit sign and the screen of Sarah's phone. They passed the wire cages of the tenant storage units. Elena's unit, 4B, sat like a ghost in the dark, her boxes of paintings and winter gear a reminder of the life she had been living before the struggle. They reached the heavy, grey metal door. It looked even more imposing now. "This is it," Mark said. He slid the key into the lock. It didn't turn at first. He felt a moment of pure panic. Did I grab the wrong one? But then, with a sharp, heavy click, the mechanism surrendered. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. The room was not a maintenance closet. It was a high-tech workshop. The rhythmic machine sound Mark had heard was coming from a row of large, professional-grade printers. But they weren't printing travel brochures. The floor was covered in fine, colorful dust, the kind used in high-end inks. On a long metal table in the center of the room sat several of the heavy black plastic bags Mark had seen the night before. One was open. Sarah gasped and pointed. Inside the bag were stacks of what looked like 18th century landscape paintings, carefully removed from their frames and rolled into tubes. Next to them were several passports with different names but the same face. The man in the grey coat. "It's an art forgery ring," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "They're using the silver oak as a hub. Henderson isn't just a manager. He's the gatekeeper. They produce the fakes here and move them out in those bags." Suddenly, the rhythmic sound of the printers stopped. A voice came from a small speaker in the corner of the room. It was Henderson's voice, sounding distorted and cold. "I knew I should have checked the alley window sooner. You're very persistent, Mark. But the silver oak doesn't like intruders." The heavy metal door behind them slammed shut. The sound of a motorized lock echoed through the room. They were trapped. The red light of a recording sign flickered above the door. Henderson's laughter crackled through the speaker once more before turning into static. Mark rushed to the door and pulled the handle. But it was solid. This wasn't a standard apartment door. It was reinforced steel. "We have to find another way out," Sarah said, her voice tight but professional. She was already moving toward the metal table, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "If they're moving forgeries, they need a paper trail, certificates of authenticity, shipping manifests, something to prove where these masterpieces came from." Mark looked around the workshop. It was organized with a terrifying, cold efficiency. He began to pull open the drawers under the long table. What Mark discovered? Chemical vials. Bottles labeled with complex chemical names used to age paint and canvas. Ledgers. Small black books filled with dates, prices, and the initials EV. The blueprint. A folded piece of paper showing the Silver Oak's ventilation system. A familiar object. Resting near the printer was a small, silver digital camera. Mark turned it on. The last photo taken was of Elena. She was sitting in a chair, her hands tied, looking defiant but exhausted. The background was a grey concrete wall. "Sarah, look," Mark whispered, holding up the camera. Sarah stared at the screen. "That wall, that's not this room. This room has insulation and soundproofing. That looks like the boiler room at the far end of the basement." "So she's still in the building," Mark said. A spark of hope lit up his chest. "If we can get out of this room, we can find her." He turned back to the printers. They were massive, expensive machines. He noticed a thick bundle of cables running from the back of the printers into a hole in the wall. The hole was covered by a loose metal grate, a ventilation duct. "The vents," Mark pointed. "In the kitchen. I thought about the vents. They're the only thing Henderson can't fully lock down without stopping the airflow to the machines. They need to keep these printers cool." Mark grabbed a heavy metal paperweight from the desk and began to unscrew the grate. It was slow work, his fingers slippery with sweat. Every second felt like a minute, and every minute felt like an hour. He expected Henderson to burst through the door at any moment with the man in the grey coat. "I've got it," Mark whispered. The grate fell away with a muffled thud. The opening was narrow, smelling of ozone and cold air. It was a dark, horizontal tunnel that led deeper into the guts of the silver oak. Mark looked at Sarah. She nodded, her face set in a look of grim determination. "You first," she said. "I'll grab the ledger. If we get out of here, we need this evidence." Mark climbed into the darkness. The metal was cold against his palms. He began to crawl, the sound of his own breathing loud in the confined space. He didn't know where the duct led, but he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving this building without Elena. The ventilation duct was a narrow, echoing tunnel. Mark's shoulders brushed against the cold metal sides as he crawled forward, the smell of dust and old grease filling his lungs. Behind him, he could hear the rhythmic scrape-slide of Sarah following him, the ledger she had grabbed tucked tightly into her jacket. They moved for what felt like an eternity, passing several grates that looked down into empty storage rooms. Finally, the air began to grow warmer. A low, industrial hum vibrated through the metal, the sound of the building's massive water boilers. Mark reached a vertical drop in the duct and looked through the slats of a final grate. Below him was a cavernous room filled with thick, insulated pipes that looked like giant white snakes. In the center of the room, sitting in a simple wooden chair, was Elena. She was alive. Her hands were bound with zip ties, and she looked exhausted, but her eyes were open and alert. Standing over her was the man in the gray coat. He was no longer wearing his coat. He was in a dark shirt, holding a roll of silver duct tape. He looked impatient. "The car is coming back in 10 minutes. Elena," the man said, his voice cold and flat. "Henderson is losing his patience. Just tell us where you hid the original ledger, and we can end this." Elena spat on the floor. "I sent it to someone who will know what to do with it. You're already finished." Mark didn't wait. He knew he couldn't overpower the man in a fair fight, but he had the element of surprise. He pushed the grate with all his strength. It burst open, clattering onto the concrete floor. Mark dropped down, landing hard but rolling to his feet. The man in the dark shirt spun around, his hand reaching for something in his waistband. Before he could react, Mark grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby tool bench and swung. The metal connected with the man's shoulder, sending him stumbling back into a cluster of hot pipes. He let out a yell of pain as the heat scorched his arm. Sarah dropped down from the vent a second later, landing with the grace of a trained athlete. She didn't hesitate. She tackled the man while he was off balance, using his own momentum to pin him against the wall. "Mark!" "The zip ties!" Sarah shouted. Mark ran to Elena. He used a small pocket knife he always carried for opening boxes to slice through the plastic ties. Elena's hands fell free, and she immediately hugged him, her body trembling. "You came back," she whispered. "We're getting out of here," Mark said, helping her stand. "Both of you." Suddenly, the heavy door to the boiler room groaned open. Mr. Henderson stood in the doorway, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. In his hand, he held a small, black remote. "You've been a very busy tenant, Mark," Henderson said, his thumb hovering over a red button. "But I think it's time for a permanent eviction." The boiler room felt like a furnace. The hum of the machinery was deafening, but the silence between Mark and Henderson was even louder. Henderson stared at them, his thumb trembling over the red button on the remote. "This building is a masterpiece of efficiency," Henderson sneered, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "One press, and the gas lines to the boilers will open. A single spark from those printers upstairs, and the silver oak becomes a memory. No forgeries, no ledger, and no witnesses. You'd kill yourself just to hide your tracks?" Sarah asked, her grip tightening on the man in the grey coat, who was still pinned against the wall. I have a path out," Henderson said, glancing at the heavy steel door behind him. "You don't." Mark looked at Elena. She was pale, but her eyes were fixed on a small red lever near the main steam pipe, the emergency shutoff. If they could trigger it, the pressure drop might stall the system, but it was 10 feet away, right in Henderson's line of sight. "Mark," Elena whispered, her hand brushing his jacket pocket. She felt the keys he had found on his first day. The yellow flower. Mark understood. He reached into his pocket and gripped the keychain. It wasn't just a decoration. It was heavy, solid brass. He looked at Sarah and gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. "Henderson!" Mark shouted, stepping forward to draw the manager's eyes. "You're a travel fan, right? You told me you liked the brochures. Let me show you something I picked up." With a sudden, violent motion, Mark hurled the brass keychain across the room. It didn't hit Henderson. Instead, it smashed into the glass face of a pressure gauge near the gas line. The glass shattered with a loud crack, and a jet of high-pressure steam hissed out, creating a blinding white cloud between them. "Now!" Sarah screamed. Henderson panicked, his vision obscured by the hot mist. He pressed the red button, but the split-second distraction was enough. Elena dived for the red lever, pulling it down with all her weight. The boilers let out a dying groan as the fuel was cut. Sarah lunged through the steam, catching Henderson's wrist before he could reach the door. She twisted the remote from his hand and swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor with a heavy thud, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. The aftermath. 10 minutes later, the alleyway was filled with the blue and red strobe lights of police cars. Sarah's call to her agency had gone through the moment they breached the boiler room door. Mark, Elena, and David, who had called the police after seeing the struggle from his window, stood by the ambulance. Elena was wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping water. "I thought I was moving into a quiet life," Mark said, looking up at the dark windows of the Silver Oak. "There's no such thing as a quiet life in this city," Elena said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "But I'm glad you were my neighbor, Mark." Sarah walked over, holding the black ledger. "This is enough to put Henderson and his artistic friends away for a long time. You've got a hell of a story for your next article, Mark." "I think I'll stick to writing about beaches for a while." Mark laughed, though his heart was finally slowing down. As the sun began to rise over the city, Mark looked at the building one last time. It was still beautiful, but the shadows were gone. He walked back inside, not as a victim, but as the man who finally turned on the lights. The sunrise over the city was a bruised purple, casting long, tired shadows across the street. For the first time since he moved into the Silver Oak apartments, Mark felt the silence of the building wasn't heavy or threatening. It was simply empty. The police tape stretched across the front doors like a yellow warning, and the lobby, once the kingdom of Mr. Henderson, was now filled with forensic teams in white suits. Mark stood in his kitchen, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the steam in the boiler room and felt the weight of the brass keychain in his hand. He looked at the boxes in his living room. He had moved here for a fresh start, a quiet place to write his travel articles. Instead, he had become the lead character in a thriller he never asked to join. A soft knock at the door made him jump, nearly spilling his coffee. He walked to the door, checking the peephole out of habit. It was Sarah. She looked different without the black veil and the investigator's disguise. She was wearing a simple leather jacket and jeans, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. Mark opened the door. "I thought you'd be at the precinct all day," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I should be." Sarah sighed, leaning against his kitchen counter. "But the ledger we found, it's more complicated than we thought." Henderson was just a franchise manager. Mark. He didn't run the forgery ring. He just provided the space and the security. Mark felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. If he didn't run it, who did? Sarah pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was a photocopy of a page from the ledger they had seized. Look at the initials at the bottom of every transaction. VK. We thought it was a code for the vault. But it's a name. Victor Kovac. He's a high-level distributor of stolen antiquities. And according to these records, he wasn't just shipping art out of the Silver Oak. He was looking for something that was already hidden here. Mark looked around his apartment. The walls suddenly felt thin again. What could be hidden here? This building was renovated 5 years ago. Everything is new. Not everything, Sarah said, walking to the large window. She pointed to the crown molding near the ceiling. The skeleton of this building is 100 years old. Before it was the Silver Oak, it was a private residence for a wealthy collector who disappeared during the war. Kovac didn't pick this building because it was fancy. He picked it because he thinks the Crown of Thorns, a lost medieval artifact, is inside these walls. Mark sat down on his sofa, feeling the weight of the information. So, the forgeries were just a cover. A way to pay the bills while they searched the building. Exactly, Sarah said. She looked at Mark with a serious expression. The police have Henderson, but Kovac is still out there. And he knows that you and Elena are the ones who shut down his operation. You aren't safe here, Mark. Not yet. Mark looked at the small, hidden camera fixture above his door, now broken and hanging by a wire. He realized the organization wasn't just a group of criminals. They were a ghost that had been haunting the Silver Oak for years. He wasn't just a tenant anymore. He was the man standing between a criminal mastermind and a treasure that had been lost for a century. Mark stared at the crown molding Sarah had pointed out. He had lived in this apartment for days, admiring the modern renovations, but he had never truly looked at the bones of the place. If what Sarah said was true, the Silver Oak was less of an apartment complex and more of a hollowed-out treasure chest. If Kovac is looking for something medieval, Mark said, his voice low, he wouldn't be looking in the new drywall. He'd be looking in the foundation, the chimneys, or the original supports. Sarah nodded. I spent the last 3 hours at the city archives before coming here. The original owner was a man named Julian Vane. He was an eccentric historian. When the city seized the property in the 1940s, they noted that the floor plans didn't match the external dimensions of the building. There were dead spaces, areas between walls that served no architectural purpose. Mark stood up and walked to the wall that separated his living room from the hallway. He tapped on the plaster. It sounded solid. He moved toward the back of the apartment, near the small laundry closet. He tapped again. This time, the sound was different. It was hollow, with a slight echo that suggested a void behind the wood. Give me that, Sarah said, reaching for a heavy metal letter opener on Mark's desk. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the tool into the seam where the closet met the wall and pried. The wood groaned and splintered. Behind the modern white paneling was a layer of old, dark oak, the original 1920s woodwork. And carved into that oak was a faint, geometric pattern. It's a cipher, Mark whispered. He recognized some of the symbols from his travel research in Europe. These are stonemason marks. They were used by builders to identify their work, but sometimes they were used as a map. The clues in the wall. A compass rose, carved into the center, but the north arrow pointed toward the floor, not the ceiling. 3 circles, intersecting in a way that resembled a Venn diagram, located near the bottom of the panel. A Latin phrase. Sub terram, veritas manet. Under the earth. The truth remains. Under the earth. Mark repeated. The basement. But we were just there. We saw the forgery workshop. If there was a secret room, Henderson would have found it. Not necessarily. Sarah countered. Henderson was looking for a workshop. He wanted space for his machines. He wasn't looking for a medieval crown. He probably thought the dead spaces were just bad Victorian engineering. As they examined the carvings, a strange sound began to emit from Mark's laptop on the desk. It was a high-pitched, rhythmic chirping. Mark ran over and opened the screen. A window had popped up, showing a scrolling line of green code. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her hand moving toward her holster. "It's my network security," Mark said, his heart racing. "Someone is trying to bypass my firewall remotely. They're not just hacking my computer, they're using the building's internal Wi-Fi to do it." Mark looked at the router in the corner. The lights were blinking frantically. Someone was in the building, sitting on the same network, watching them. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Henderson was in jail, but the eyes of the Silver Oak were still wide open. Mark's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the terminal. He was a travel writer, not a cybersecurity expert, but he knew enough about basic encryption to see that he was being dismantled. The intruder wasn't just looking for files. They were searching for a specific IP address, the one linked to the hidden camera Mark had discovered earlier. "They're not just hacking me, Sarah," Mark said, his voice strained. "They're trying to reactivate the building's local surveillance. Henderson's arrest must have tripped a dead man's switch. The system is resetting itself." Sarah stood behind him, her eyes scanning the room. "Can you trace where the signal is coming from?" "It's internal," Mark replied, hitting a final string of commands to kill his internet connection. The screen went black. "Whoever is doing this is inside the Silver Oak, and they're probably using the main server room." "There is no server room on the building plans," Sarah said, pulling out her phone to check the digital blueprints she'd stolen from the archives. "Wait," Mark said, remembering the dead spaces they had just discussed. "Look at the area behind the elevator shaft on the 7th floor. On the plans, it's listed as a ventilation plenum, but the power draw for that floor is 3 times higher than any other." They didn't take the elevator. Taking the elevator meant being a trapped target in a metal box. Instead, they took the service stairs, climbing silently. By the time they reached the 7th floor, Mark's lungs were burning. The hallway was identical to the others. Blue carpet, cream walls, and the faint smell of lemon polish. But as they neared the end of the hall, Mark heard it, the low, persistent hum of high-powered cooling fans. It was a sound he knew from his days working in busy newsrooms. Sarah held up a hand, signaling for him to stay back. She approached a service door labeled electric closet. She pressed her ear to the wood, then looked back at Mark and shook her head. No sound of breathing, just the machines. She turned the handle. It was unlocked. The room was tiny, filled from floor to ceiling with black server racks. Blue and green lights flickered in the darkness like the eyes of a digital beast. In the center of the room, a single laptop was perched on a plastic crate, connected to the main hub. Mark stepped in and looked at the laptop screen. It showed a live feed of the building's hallways. One window was zoomed in on Mark's front door. Another showed the basement. But the third window was different. It showed a thermal heat map of the building's foundation. "They're using ground-penetrating radar," Mark whispered, pointing at the screen. "They've linked the building's security sensors to a radar array. They aren't looking for people anymore. They're looking for the crown." Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing at a blinking red on the thermal map. The dot was located deep beneath the basement floor, in a cavity that didn't appear on any blueprint. "They found it," Sarah said. Suddenly, the server room door slammed shut behind them. The magnetic lock engaged. A voice came through the laptop speakers, distorted, deep, and mocking. "Thank you for the shortcut, Mr. Mark. You and the investigator have been most helpful. But now, the Silver Oak is going into lockdown. Enjoy the silence." The lights in the server room turned bright red. A high-pitched alarm began to scream, and Mark realized the lockdown wasn't just about the doors. The ventilation fans reversed, and the smell of ozone filled the small space. They were being sealed in, and the air was about to run out. The red emergency lights bathed the server room in a crimson glow, making the blinking LEDs of the server racks look like predatory eyes. The high-pitched scream of the alarm was physically painful, vibrating in Mark's teeth. He lunged for the door, pulling the handle with everything he had, but the magnetic lock held firm. "It's no use," Sarah shouted over the siren. She was already at the laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. "The system is on a hardwired override. It's a closed-loop security protocol. We're being scrubbed." Mark looked up at the ventilation duct. The fans, which usually pulled hot air out, were now spinning in reverse. But the air coming in was thin and smelled of metallic chemicals. "Sarah, they're not just locking the door. They're sucking the oxygen out of the room to protect the servers from a fire that doesn't exist." It was a standard fire suppression tactic for high-end data centers, hypoxic air venting. It would keep the machines cool and the electronics safe, but it would kill any human inside in less than 10 minutes. "I can't bypass the physical lock from here," Sarah grunted, her face pale under the red lights. "But I can see the security feed. Mark, look." She pointed to the laptop screen. In the basement, the thermal map was no longer just a static image. A group of 4 men, led by a figure in a heavy tactical vest, had entered the forgery workshop. They weren't carrying paint or canvas. They were carrying jackhammers and specialized drills. "Kovac's team," Mark said, his breath hitching. The air was already starting to feel heavy, making his head throb. "They're going to breach the cavity tonight while the police are busy processing Henderson at the precinct. We need to short-circuit the lock," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave as she fought for breath. She looked at the server racks. "Mark, the main power coupling. If we can create a surge, the maglock might fail-safe and release." Mark looked at the racks. They were bolted to the floor, but the cables at the back were thick and bundled with heavy-duty ties. "If I pull those, I'll get electrocuted." "Use your jacket," Sarah yelled. She grabbed a metal rack mount ear from a box of spare parts and handed it to him. "Bridge the positive and negative terminals on the primary UPS, the uninterruptible power supply." Mark took the metal piece. He felt lightheaded, his vision tunneling. He moved to the bottom of the rack where the massive battery backups sat. The hum of the machines was now a roar in his ears. He wrapped his thick winter jacket around his hands, gripped the metal bar, and shoved it into the exposed power junction. A massive blue arc of electricity erupted, illuminating the room in a blinding flash. The smell of scorched plastic filled the air. Every server in the room let out a dying whine as the lights went black. For a heartbeat, there was total silence. Then, a heavy clack echoed through the room. Mark threw his weight against the door. It swung open, and he tumbled into the hallway, gasping for the cool, oxygen-rich air of the 7th floor. Sarah crawled out after him, coughing violently. They lay on the blue carpet for a moment, the world spinning. Mark looked at his hands. The jacket was charred, but he was alive. "We have to go down," Sarah wheezed, pushing herself up. "The police won't get here in time," Mark said, his voice raspy. "They're already drilling. If Kovac gets the crown, he won't just leave. He'll burn this building to cover his tracks." Mark grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the hallway wall. He wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't a spy, but he was a tenant of the Silver Oak, and he was tired of people breaking into his home. The elevator was dead, a casualty of the power surge Mark had triggered upstairs. The building was now a dark, silent monolith, illuminated only by the flickering green emergency lights in the stairwell. Mark and Sarah descended rapidly, their footsteps echoing like gunshots against the concrete. By the time they reached the basement level, the air was vibrating with a rhythmic, bone-deep thrumming. "The jackhammers," Sarah whispered, her hand hovering over her service weapon. "They've started." They moved through the basement, passing the wire storage units. The forgery workshop door was wide open, light spilling out into the hall. Mark peered around the corner. The room was transformed. The large printers had been pushed aside, and the center of the floor was a chaotic mess of concrete dust and jagged stone. Two men in work jumpsuits were operating a heavy-duty pneumatic drill, while a third, the man in the tactical vest, stood guard with a short-barreled shotgun. "That's Kovac's lieutenant," Sarah murmured. "He's a mercenary. We can't take him head-on with a fire extinguisher and a pistol." Mark looked at the layout of the room. The pipes he had seen earlier, the ones leading to the boilers, ran directly over the spot where they were drilling. He also noticed a series of heavy chains hanging from the ceiling, used for moving the massive printing presses. "Sarah, look at the drill," Mark pointed. "They're using a wet core bit. It needs a constant flow of water to keep from overheating and seizing. The hose is connected to the main utility sink in the corner. If we cut the water, the bit will melt and lock into the concrete," Sarah finished his thought. "But we need a distraction to get to the valve." Mark looked at the fire extinguisher in his hand. It wasn't just a heavy object. It was a pressurized canister of CO2. "I'll give you your distraction. When the room fills with white fog, find the water line." Mark didn't wait for her to agree. He pulled the pin on the extinguisher and stepped into the doorway. With a roar, he squeezed the trigger. A massive, freezing cloud of white carbon dioxide hissed into the room, instantly obscuring the guards and the drillers. "What the?" a voice shouted from the mist. The lieutenant fired a shot toward the door, the boom of the shotgun deafening in the small space. But Mark had already ducked behind a heavy metal cabinet. Sarah moved like a shadow through the fog, her knowledge of the room's layout guiding her. The sound of a heavy metal valve being wrenched shut echoed through the workshop. Seconds later, the drill let out a high-pitched, agonizing scream of metal-on-metal friction. A smell of burning rubber and scorched stone filled the air. With a violent snap, the drill bit seized, the motor kicking back and throwing the two workers to the floor. "Move!" Sarah yelled, grabbing Mark's arm. They scrambled toward the back of the workshop, toward the hole they had begun to dig. But as the fog cleared, they realized they weren't alone. Standing in the secondary doorway, silhouetted by the dim emergency lights, was a man in a perfectly tailored grey suit. He wasn't the man in the grey coat from before. This man was older, with silver hair and eyes that looked like chips of flint. "Mr. Mark, I presume," the man said. His voice was melodic, almost pleasant. "You have a remarkable talent for being inconvenient. I am Victor Kovac, and I believe you are standing on my property." Kovac stepped into the room, and the lieutenant recovered, leveling his shotgun at Mark's chest. The property Kovac was referring to wasn't the building. It was the dark, square cavity revealed beneath the shattered concrete, a hidden stone vault that had been sealed for nearly a century. The air in the forgery workshop was thick with the scent of ozone, burnt stone, and the biting cold of the CO2 fog. Victor Kovac stood with an unsettling stillness, his silver hair shimmering under the flickering emergency lights. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a curator surveying a private gallery. But the men behind him, armed and dangerous, told a different story. "The Silver Oak has many layers, doesn't it?" Kovac said, his eyes never leaving Mark. Julian Vane was a man of excessive caution. He knew that the world was changing, that treasures like the Crown of Thorns would eventually be hunted by men less appreciative than himself. Mark shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the hole in the floor. The drill had stopped just short of the main seal. If it's so valuable, Why hide it in a basement in the middle of the city? Because the best place to hide a secret is in plain sight, beneath the feet of people too busy to look down. Kovac replied. He gestured to his lieutenant. Finish it. Use the manual breaker. The lieutenant stepped forward, handing his shotgun to one of the workers. He picked up a heavy sledgehammer and began to strike the edge of the stone vault. Each blow sent a jarring vibration through the floor. Mark felt a sense of dread. If they opened that vault, Kovac would have no reason to keep them alive. Sarah. Mark whispered. The ledger. Does it say anything about a failsafe? Sarah was watching the wall, her eyes scanning the pipes and wires that crisscrossed the ceiling. Vane wasn't just a historian. He was an engineer. If this is a true medieval-style vault, it's not just a box. It's a mechanism. She pointed to the corners of the stone slab. There were 4 small, circular indentations, barely visible under the dust. They weren't drill holes, they were keyholes, but not for any key Mark had ever seen. Suddenly, Mark remembered the carvings in his wall upstairs. The 3 intersecting circles. The compass rose pointing down. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass keychain with the yellow flower. He looked at the base of the flower. It wasn't flat. It had 3 small, raised ridges that matched the pattern of the circles. It's not a keychain. Mark realized, his voice barely audible over the sound of the sledgehammer. It's a tumbler. Give it to me, Kovac said, his voice losing its pleasant tone. He had noticed the object in Mark's hand. Now, Mr. Mark, or the investigator dies first. The lieutenant stopped swinging the hammer and turned the shotgun back towards Sarah. Mark looked at the keychain, then at the hole. He knew that if he gave Kovac the key, the vault would open, and their usefulness would end. But if he didn't, Sarah would die right now. I'll open it, Mark said, stepping toward the hole. But only if you let her go to the stairs. Kovac smiled, a cold, thin expression. You are in no position to negotiate, but I admire the sentiment. Move to the stairs, agent, but stay where my man can see you. Sarah looked at Mark, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a silent command to be careful. She backed away toward the exit. Mark knelt by the stone slab, his heart pounding against his ribs. He placed the brass flower into the first indentation. It fit perfectly. He turned it. The sound was deep, like the heartbeat of the building itself. A second later, a low grinding noise started behind the walls. The dead spaces Sarah had mentioned weren't just empty. They were filled with counterweights. The second one, Kovac commanded, leaning over the hole. Mark moved to the next corner. As he turned the key, he noticed a small copper tube hidden inside the indentation. It was a pressure sensor. Vane hadn't just built a vault. He had built a trap. If the weight on the slab changed too quickly, or if it was opened without the proper sequence, the entire room would be flooded with something far worse than steam. Mark looked up at the ceiling pipes. One of them was labeled with a yellow stripe. Natural gas. The air in the basement had grown thick with the scent of old dust and something sharper, the metallic tang of ancient gears coming to life. Mark knelt over the stone slab, the brass flower key gripped tightly in his sweating palm. He had turned 2 of the 4 locks. The grinding sound behind the walls was constant now, a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth. Keep going, Kovac urged, his voice tight with anticipation. He was standing at the very edge of the pit, his expensive leather shoes dusted with white concrete powder. The third corner. Mr. Mark, do not test my patience. Mark moved to the third indentation. He looked back at Sarah, who was standing near the stairwell door. The lieutenant was still aiming the shotgun at her, but his eyes were flickering toward the hole, drawn by the same greed as his boss. Mark noticed Sarah was looking at the ceiling, her lips moving silently as she traced the path of the yellow-striped gas pipe. "Mark," she said, her voice steady. "Remember the dead spaces. The counterweights aren't just for the door." Mark looked down at the third lock. He saw the copper tube again. He realized that the stone slab wasn't just a lid. It was a giant pressure plate. The mechanism was measuring the weight of the people standing around the hole. If the weight shifted too suddenly, or if the sequence of the locks was interrupted, the counterweights wouldn't lift the slab. They would drop the main support for the gas manifold. "Victor," Mark said, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "This vault is rigged. It's weighing us. If you don't step back, the pressure sensor will trip. Look at the copper tubes." Kovac looked down, his brow furrowing. For a second, his confidence wavered. He saw the intricate network of wires and tubes weaving through the stone. A bluff. A desperate attempt to buy time. "It's not a bluff," Mark countered, his hand hovering over the third lock. Julian Vane didn't want his treasure stolen by a mob. He built a tomb. If the weight exceeds 500 pounds on the perimeter, the locks won't engage. They'll trigger the purge. Kovac looked at his lieutenant and the two workers. Together, they easily weighed over 700 pounds. The tension in the room snapped like a bowed string. Kovac motioned for the two workers to move back toward the storage cages. "Step back, Boris," Kovac commanded the lieutenant. "Stay by the door with the investigator. I will oversee this myself." The weight shifted. The grinding sound changed pitch, becoming smoother. Mark turned the third lock. A section of the wall behind the storage units slid open 6 inches, revealing a vertical shaft filled with heavy iron weights suspended on rusted chains. The mechanism was priming. Mark moved to the final corner. This was the moment of truth. "Wait," Kovac said, his hand reaching out. "If the fourth lock is turned, does the slab lift, or does it drop? Only one way to find out." Mark said. He looked at Sarah. He saw her grip the handle of the heavy fire door. She was ready to bolt. Mark inserted the key into the final hole. He felt the internal tumblers align. He didn't turn it immediately. He looked Kovac in the eye. "Whatever is in here, it's been hidden for a century for a reason. Are you sure you want to see what's at the bottom of the silver oak?" Kovac's eyes were wild with a feverish light. "Turn the key." Mark twisted the brass flower. There was no click this time. Instead, there was a long, low hiss of escaping air, the sound of a vacuum seal breaking. The stone slab began to descend slowly into the floor, like a grand elevator of the dead. As it sank, a hidden compartment in the side of the shaft began to rotate. But it wasn't the crown of thorns that emerged first. It was a secondary pipe, connected directly to the gas line, which began to vent a thick, amber-colored vapor into the pit. "It's not gas," Sarah screamed, covering her nose. "It's a fire suppressant. It's halon." The amber mist was heavy and cold, pouring over the edges of the pit and filling the room. Mark scrambled backward as the air was sucked out of his lungs. Kovac, blinded by the fog and the sudden roar of the machinery, lunged into the mist, reaching for the rotating compartment. The halon gas surged out of the floor like a silent, golden tide. It was a terrifyingly efficient fire suppressant. It didn't just put out flames. It chemically inhibited the combustion of oxygen. For the people in the room, it meant that every breath they took felt empty, as if they were trying to breathe underwater. Mark rolled away from the pit, his lungs burning. The amber mist was thickest near the floor, swirling around his legs. He saw Sarah dart into the stairwell, pulling the heavy fire door shut behind her, just as the lieutenant fired a final, desperate shot that sparked against the steel frame. Kovac, however, was obsessed. He was leaning over the descending slab, his hands clawing at the rotating compartment. "It's here," he choked out, his voice thin and high-pitched due to the gas. "I see it." In the center of the descending stone, a silver box sat atop a velvet cushion. It was encrusted with dust and age, but even in the dim light, the glint of gold and jewels was unmistakable. This was the crown of thorns, not the biblical relic, but the legendary 12th century masterpiece of the Plantagenet kings, lost during the chaos of the French Revolution and smuggled into the foundations of this very building. Mark scrambled to his feet, dizzy and gasping. He knew that the Halan would eventually dissipate, but right now, the room was a death trap. He looked at the lieutenant, who was slumped against the wall, dropping his shotgun as he struggled to remain conscious. The gas was heavier than air, and it was filling the basement from the ground up. "Kovac, get out of there!" Mark yelled, his voice sounding strange in the dense atmosphere. "The mechanism is still moving. It's not a shelf, it's a centrifuge." As the slab reached the bottom of its path, the grinding noise intensified into a mechanical scream. The rotating compartment began to spin faster. Vane hadn't just used gas to protect the crown. He had used physics. The silver box wasn't sitting on a cushion. It was locked into a weighted armature. If anyone tried to lift the box without disengaging the centrifugal lock, the entire armature would retract into a lead-lined sleeve, burying the treasure forever. Kovac didn't listen. He reached into the pit, his fingers brushing the silver box. "Don't!" Mark lunged forward, grabbing Kovac's coat and pulling him back just as the armature snapped shut. The sound was like a guillotine. The silver box vanished into the floor with a violent thud, and the stone slab suddenly reversed, moving upward with incredible speed. If Mark hadn't pulled Kovac back, the man's arms would have been severed by the rising stone. "No!" Kovac screamed, falling onto the dusty floor. He pounded his fists against the rising slab. "It's gone. You ruined it. I saved your life, you idiot." Mark wheezed, dragging Kovac toward the door. The amber fog was thinning, but the room was still dangerous. Mark reached the stairwell door and pounded on the glass. Sarah opened it, her face pale, and helped him pull Kovac into the safety of the pressurized stairwell. The basement was now silent. The stone slab had returned to its original position, looking like nothing more than a patch of broken concrete. The dead spaces had done their job. The treasure of Julian Vane had retreated back into the earth, protected by a mechanical guardian that had outsmarted a modern criminal. Kovac sat on the stairs, his head in his hands, weeping not for his life, but for the gold he had almost touched. Mark looked at Sarah. She was already on her radio, calling for backup. "It's over," she said, looking at Mark. "Is it?" Mark asked, looking at the brass flower keychain still in his hand. He noticed a small, hidden compartment in the base of the flower had clicked open during the struggle. Inside was a tiny, rolled-up piece of vellum. The sirens of the approaching police fleet wailed in the distance, a stark contrast to the heavy, gas-chilled silence of the stairwell. Mark sat on the cold concrete step, his fingers trembling as he teased the tiny roll of vellum out of the base of the brass flower. Kovac was being handcuffed to the railing by a recovered Sarah, his face a mask of broken ambition. He didn't even look at them. His eyes were fixed on the heavy fire door, mourning the vault he couldn't conquer. Mark carefully unrolled the parchment. It was thin, translucent, and covered in a fine, elegant script that had survived a century in the dark. It wasn't a map, and it wasn't a confession. It was a letter written in a mixture of English and Latin. To the one who possesses the key of the third circle. Know that the crown is but a vessel. The true weight of Julian Vane's legacy is not in the gold of the Plantagenets, but in the truth of their fall. Look not to the earth for the prize, but to the light that reveals the shadow. "What is it?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him after checking Kovac's restraints. She looked at the ancient ink. "A riddle?" Vane was obsessed with puzzles, but this feels like a redirection. Mark looked back at the basement door. The slab had reset. The mechanical centrifuge had swallowed the silver box. He said the crown is a vessel, and to look to the light that reveals the shadow. He stood up, his mind racing through the last few hours. The dead spaces in the walls, the thermal maps, the ground-penetrating radar, they had all been focused on the foundation. But David, the artist from 2A, had mentioned something else. He had talked about the windows. He had talked about the way the light hit the building at sunset. "Sarah, where is Elena?" Mark asked suddenly. "She's with the paramedics in the front." "Why?" "I need to see her apartment again. 4B. "Mark, the building is a crime scene," Sarah cautioned, but she saw the look in his eyes. It was the same look he had when he'd found the hidden camera. "Fine. But we move fast. The feds will be here in 10 minutes to take over." They bypassed the elevators again and climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. The hallway was eerie, illuminated by the red and blue flashes from the street below. They entered apartment 4B. It was still a mess from the search, the chemical smell of the cleaning products still lingering. Mark walked straight to the living room. He looked at the spot where the blue vase had shattered. Then he looked at the window. The moon was high and bright, casting a sharp, silvery light across the floor. The vase wasn't just a decoration. Mark whispered. Elena said it was a gift from her grandmother, who lived in this building when it was still a private house. He looked at the floor where the red stain had been. The moonlight hit a specific patch of the hardwood. In the center of that patch, there was a tiny, circular inlay of brass, almost invisible against the dark wood. It was the 3rd circle mentioned in the scroll. Mark knelt and placed the brass flower keychain directly onto the inlay. Suddenly, a beam of moonlight passed through the window's leaded glass. Glass that Mark now realized was ground into a specific lens shape. The light hit the brass flower, and instead of reflecting, it was channeled. A sharp, needle-thin beam of light shot across the room, hitting the wall above the fireplace. The light revealed a shadow, a silhouette that didn't match the furniture. It was the shadow of a keyhole, projected onto the wallpaper by the lens in the window. "The shadow is the door," Mark said, his voice hushed. He walked to the fireplace. He pressed his hand against the wall where the shadow fell. The wallpaper felt different there, colder, like it was covering stone. He pushed. With a soft, pneumatic hiss, a small section of the chimney breast slid back. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a single, heavy iron key. The ledger Kovac wanted was a fake. Mark realized, picking up the journal. This is the real record. It's not just about art forgeries. It's a list of every person who has lived in this building for the last 80 years, and the secrets they left behind. The Silver Oak wasn't just a hub for a forgery ring. It was a blackmail archive. And Julian Vane had been the first librarian. The leather-bound journal felt unexpectedly heavy in Mark's hands, its surface cool and waxy. As he opened the first page, the smell of aged vellum and dried ink wafted up, a scent of preserved time. This wasn't a modern logbook. It was a meticulous record of human frailty. "Mark, look at these dates," Sarah whispered, leaning over his shoulder. The entries began in 1946. Each page was dedicated to a tenant. There were names of former governors, shipping magnates, and even a silent film star who had lived out her final days in 5A. Beside each name were detailed notes on indiscretions, gambling debts, secret families, and evidence of wartime profiteering. Vane wasn't just a historian, Mark said, his voice trembling. He was a collector of leverage. He built the Silver Oak as a giant filing cabinet. The crown of thorns in the basement. It was the ultimate bait. Anyone who came looking for the gold would never suspect the real power was hidden in the walls of the apartments themselves. Suddenly, The iron key Mark had found alongside the journal began to vibrate. It was a subtle, high-frequency hum that resonated through his palm. He looked at the key. It was made of a dark, non-reflective metal. He noticed a small electronic component embedded near the bow, a modern addition to an ancient tool. "That's a proximity sensor," Sarah warned, her hand dropping to the radio on her belt. "The journal was a trigger. By removing it from the fireplace, you've signaled someone." Before they could move, the apartment's front door, which had been standing ajar, swung shut. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in the cold, silver wash of the moonlight. "The feds should be here by now," Mark said, peering through the darkness. "Why is it so quiet?" "Because they didn't call the feds," a voice said from the shadows of the hallway. It wasn't Kovac. It wasn't Henderson. The voice was familiar, yet stripped of its previous warmth. David, the artist from 2A, stepped into the living room. He was no longer wearing his paint-stained shirt. He wore a crisp, charcoal tactical suit, and in his hand, he held a silenced pistol. "David?" Mark asked, stunned. You helped me. You showed me the painting." "I showed you exactly what I needed you to see, Mark," David said, his voice flat and professional. Kovac was a blunt instrument. He was obsessed with the shiny yellow metal in the basement. He was a useful distraction while I waited for someone to solve Vane's final puzzle. I've lived in this building for 10 years, and I couldn't find the third circle without the key of the flower. "You're the archivist," Sarah realized, her gun still in its holster, held in place by David's steady aim. "The one the ledger mentioned. The protector of the secrets." "Protector?" "No." David smiled, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the broker. Information is the only currency that never devalues. Henderson and Kovac were amateurs playing with toys. This journal, this is the heart of the Silver Oak. And now that you've done the heavy lifting of finding it, I'll take it from here." Mark noticed a small, blinking device on David's belt. "You're jamming the police radios, aren't you? That's why no one has come up yet. I have 5 minutes before the backup realizes the silence is artificial." David said, "Hand over the journal and the iron key. Mark, you've played your part in the story. Don't make me write a tragic ending for you." Mark looked at the iron key in his hand. It wasn't just a key to a door. He realized now it was likely the key to the entire digital archive Sarah had seen on the 7th floor. The paper journal was the index. The key was the access. He looked at Sarah, then back at the artist who had betrayed them. He realized that the Silver Oak hadn't finished its lessons yet. The moonlight shifted, casting David's shadow long and jagged across the floorboards. The silenced pistol in his hand was rock steady, a stark contrast to the eccentric, flighty artist Mark thought he knew. The betrayal stung more than the cold air in the room. Every neighborly conversation they'd had was now revealed as a calculated interrogation. "The iron key, Mark," David repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Drop it into the center of the journal and step back. My patience is as thin as that vellum scroll." Mark looked down at the key. The vibration had intensified, a high-frequency hum that made his bones ache. It wasn't just a proximity sensor. He realized the key was reacting to a magnetic induction loop hidden beneath the floor of apartment 4B. Vane hadn't just built a safe. He had built a resonant chamber. "You know," Mark said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the gun leveled at his chest. "You missed a detail in your 10 years of residency. David, you called yourself a broker, but you're still just looking at the surface. You think this key is for a digital archive on the 7th floor." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "It is the master encryption token. I've seen the hardware. It's more than that." Mark countered, slowly moving the key in a small arc. As he moved it, the pitch of the hum changed. It's a magnetic transducer. Vane didn't trust electricity. He trusted physics. Mark noticed Sarah's eyes darting toward the heavy brass floor inlay. The third circle. She was waiting for his signal. Mark knew that if he could disrupt the magnetic field, he might be able to short-circuit the jammer on David's belt. The scroll said to look to the light that reveals the shadow. Mark continued, his heart hammering. But the shadow isn't just a picture on the wall. It's an electromagnetic shadow. With a sudden, violent motion, Mark didn't drop the key. He slammed it onto the brass inlay with all his strength. The reaction was instantaneous. The iron key, acting as a bridge for the induction loop, created a massive electromagnetic pulse within the localized area. A sharp blue spark jumped from the inlay to the key, and a loud, metallic thrum echoed through the room. The device on David's belt let out a pathetic puff of smoke and a dying whine. The jamming field collapsed instantly. Startled by the sudden flash and the jolt of static electricity, David's shot went wide, the bullet thudding harmlessly into the wooden mantelpiece. Downstairs, the police radios suddenly crackled to life with a roar of static and urgent voices. Sarah didn't miss her window. She lunged low, her shoulder hitting David in the midsection and driving him back into the kitchen. The pistol skittered across the floor, disappearing under the refrigerator. "Mark, get the journal." Sarah yelled as she grappled with David, whose tactical training was now on full display. He was fast, his movements a blur of strikes and blocks. Mark grabbed the leather-bound book, but as he did, he realized the iron key was now stuck to the floor. The magnetic surge had effectively welded it to the brass inlay. He pulled, but it wouldn't budge. "I can't get the key." Mark shouted, "Leave it." Sarah commanded, ducking a vicious roundhouse kick. "The police are on the stairs. Just get the book and get out." But Mark saw something David hadn't. The EMP hadn't just killed the jammer. It had triggered a secondary pneumatic release in the ceiling. A small hatch opened directly above the fireplace, and a heavy, silver-plated cylinder began to descend on a wire. It was the vessel mentioned in the scroll. The crown of thorns wasn't in the basement. The basement was the distraction. The true relic, and the real danger, was descending right into his hands. The silver-plated cylinder descended with a rhythmic, clockwork precision, its surface gleaming under the harsh strobing of the police lights outside. Mark stood frozen, his hands still clutching the leather-bound journal. The atmosphere in apartment 4B had shifted from a scene of betrayal to one of ancient, mechanical theater. David, sensing his prize was within reach, shoved Sarah back with a desperate strength. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the cylinder. "The archive is nothing without the seal," he roared, his mask of professional calm finally shattering into pure, unadulterated greed. Sarah recovered quickly, her hand finding the pepper spray on her belt. She deployed a sharp burst, catching David in the eyes. He let out a strangled cry, stumbling back and clutching his face, but his momentum carried him into the fireplace mantel. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed the cylinder as it reached eye level. It was cold, unrealistically cold, and covered in fine, etched runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. It wasn't just a container. It was a cryogenic storage unit. "Mark, don't open it," Sarah shouted, wiping sweat and plaster dust from her forehead. "If that thing has been sealed for a century, the pressure change alone could be lethal." Mark felt the cylinder vibrate. A small digital display, hidden beneath a sliding silver plate, flickered to life. It didn't show numbers. It showed a countdown of atmospheric bars. The vessel was depressurizing itself automatically now that it had been retrieved from its housing. "It's not just gold in here," Mark realized, looking at the frost forming on the metal. Vane was a historian. but he was also a biologist. The scroll said the crown was a vessel for the truth of their fall. He remembered his research into the 12th century. The fall of the Plantagenets wasn't just about war and politics. It was a time of the Great Plague, of biological mysteries that changed the course of history. "Sarah, we need to get this out of here," Mark said, his voice dropping an octave. "If this is what I think it is." Henderson and Kovac weren't just looking for a crown. They were looking for a weapon. The sound of heavy boots thundered in the hallway. The police had finally breached the 4th floor. The door to 4B was kicked open, and a tactical team flooded the room, their weapon lights cutting through the moonlit haze. "Drop the object. Hands in the air," a voice commanded. Mark held the cylinder tight. "This is a biohazard. Secure the room and call the CDC." The lead officer hesitated, his light falling on the frost-covered cylinder and the ancient journal. David, still blinded and groaning on the floor, was quickly restrained. Sarah showed her credentials, her face grim. "He's right," Sarah told the officers. "This building isn't just a crime scene. It's a tomb for something that was never meant to be woken up." As the tactical team moved to secure the perimeter, Mark looked down at the cylinder. The countdown reached 0. With a soft, musical chime, the top of the vessel began to rotate. A thin wisp of white vapor escaped, smelling of ancient cedar and something sharp, like ozone. Inside the cylinder, nestled in a bed of chemically preserved silk, was the crown of thorns. But it wasn't made of gold. It was made of calcified bone, intricately carved and polished to a mirror shine. And embedded in the center of the brow was a small, sealed glass vial containing a dark, swirling liquid. The truth of their fall wasn't a story. It was the original strain of a forgotten plague, a secret that Julian Vane had kept hidden in the heart of the Silver Oak, waiting for a key that should have never been turned. The atmosphere in apartment 4B shifted instantly from a police raid to a high-stakes quarantine. The sight of the bone crown and the dark, swirling vial silenced the room. The tactical officers, trained for shooters and thieves, instinctively stepped back, their weapon lights trembling against the frost-covered cylinder. "Nobody moves." Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. "Seal the vents. If that vial breaks, this entire building becomes a graveyard." The lead officer signaled his team. "Perimeter lockdown. Nobody enters or leaves the Silver Oak. Get the hazmat units from the downtown hub now." Mark felt the cold from the cylinder seeping through his sleeves. He looked at the bone crown. It was hauntingly beautiful, the calcified texture resembling white marble. But the vial was the true heart of the vessel. Julian Vane hadn't just been a collector of secrets, he was a gatekeeper of a catastrophe. "Mark, put it down. Gently," Sarah instructed, her eyes fixed on the glass. Mark knelt and placed the cylinder on the coffee table, right where the blue vase had once stood. The irony wasn't lost on him. The vase had been a fragile container of beauty. This was a fragile container of death. As he let go, he noticed something etched into the base of the vial. 1347. The year the Black Death arrived in Europe. Mark whispered, his voice shaking. Vane didn't find a cure. He found the source. He preserved the most lethal iteration of the plague. David, pinned to the floor by an officer, began to laugh. "You think you're saving everyone? That vial is the only reason this building was never torn down. It's the insurance policy Vane left behind. The moment the seal is broken, the air filtration system in the Silver Oak is designed to pull the contents of that vial and distribute it through every floor." "What?" Sarah lunged toward David. "Where is the trigger?" "It's not a button." David sneered, his eyes still red from the pepper spray. "It's a barometric sensor." The vessel was the plug. Now that the cylinder has been removed from the chimney housing, the pressure in the vents is dropping. In 10 minutes, The system will assume the vault has been breached by force and sanitize the premises. Mark looked up at the ventilation grate in the ceiling. He remembered the sound of the fans reversing in the server room. He remembered the dead spaces. The building wasn't just a filing cabinet. It was a delivery system. "Sarah, we have to stop the main fan in the basement," Mark said, his mind racing. If the pressure hits the critical floor, the vial won't just sit there. The secondary pneumatic line will shatter it. The basement is still full of halon gas. Sarah countered. "We can't get to the main controls without oxygen tanks." Mark looked at the leather-bound journal. He flipped to the very last page, past the names of the tenants. There was a hand-drawn schematic of the building's lungs, the HVAC system. "There's a manual override." Mark pointed to a small lever indicated in the drawing. "It's not in the basement. It's in the elevator machine room on the roof." Vane knew the basement could be flooded or compromised. The kill switch is at the highest point. "Go!" Sarah ordered the tactical team leader. "Take Mark. He knows the schematic. I'm staying here to make sure David doesn't have a backup plan." Mark grabbed his jacket and the journal. He didn't look back. He ran for the service stairs, his legs screaming as he began the long climb to the roof. Every breath felt like he was inhaling the history of the building, a history that was currently counting down to its final, lethal breath. The stairwell was a vertical tunnel of concrete and shadows, punctuated only by the rhythmic, heavy boots of Mark and the sharp gear of the tactical officer. His name was Miller, a man of few words whose only focus was the task at hand. They had cleared the 6th floor, their lungs burning as the air grew thinner and colder. 5 minutes. Miller grunted, checking a digital timer on his wrist. "If the barometric sensor hits the floor, we're done. The whole block will be under a dome by morning." Mark didn't answer. He was focused on the leather-bound journal tucked under his arm. He had memorized the schematic on the final page, a complex web of levers and gears that Julian Vane had dubbed the Great Bellows. The Silver Oak wasn't just a building, it was an organism, and they were racing toward its brain. They reached the final door. It was heavy, industrial steel, marked with a faded sign, "Roof access, authorized personnel only." Miller kicked it open, and they were hit by a blast of frigid night air and the overwhelming roar of the city. The roof was a forest of ventilation pipes, satellite dishes, and humming air conditioning units. In the center stood a small, brick structure, the elevator machine room. Mark ran toward it, his eyes scanning the structure for the mechanical override. "There!" Mark pointed to a rusted iron wheel protruding from the side of the brick housing. It was connected to a series of thick, vertical rods that disappeared into the roof. As they approached, a shadow detached itself from the side of the building. It was the shorter man from the crate delivery, the one who had complained about the weight. He wasn't a simple mover. He was holding a high-caliber wrench, his face twisted in a desperate, frantic grimace. "Stay back!" The man screamed over the wind. The archivist said the pressure must fall. It's the only way to reset the system. "He's lying to you," Mark shouted, his voice cracking. "The reset is a plague. You'll be the first to die up here." Miller didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon, but the man lunged, swinging the heavy wrench with a strength born of terror. The metal connected with Miller's forearm, a sickening sound echoing through the air. The officer's weapon skittered across the gravel roof. Mark didn't think. He tackled the man, the two of them crashing into the brick housing. Mark was taller, but the worker was solid, a man of manual labor. They grappled on the edge of the roof, the city lights a dizzying blur 100 feet below. "The wheel!" Miller groaned, clutching his broken arm and pointing. "Mark, the wheel!" Mark threw a desperate punch, catching the worker on the jaw. As the man slumped, Mark scrambled toward the iron wheel. It was cold, the metal biting into his palms. He gripped it and turned. It didn't move. It's locked by a secondary pin. Mark yelled, looking at the base. He saw a small, brass housing with 3 circular holes, the same pattern as the third circle. He reached into his pocket. His heart stopped. The brass flower keychain was gone. He remembered it stuck to the floor in 4B, welded by the EMP. "I don't have the key." "Use the journal," Miller shouted. "The spine. Look at the spine." Mark looked at the leather-bound book. The thick, wooden spine wasn't just decorative. It had 3 small, brass studs. He jammed the book's spine into the housing and twisted. The sound was internal, a massive heavy weight shifting deep within the building. The wheel suddenly spun free. Mark turned it clockwise, his muscles screaming. Below them, a deep, resonant hum began to fade. The great bellows were slowing down. The air pressure stabilized. On Miller's wrist, the timer hit 0, but instead of an alarm, a green light flickered. The manual override had held. The sanitization protocol had been aborted. Mark collapsed against the brick wall, the cold wind whipping his hair. He looked at the city, peaceful and unaware of the invisible ghost that had almost been released into its streets. He held the journal tight. They had saved the city, but the secrets of the Silver Oak were now exposed to the light of day. The dawn was no longer a bruised purple. It had bleached into a cold, clinical grey. Mark stood on the roof of the Silver Oak, his breath hitching in the sharp morning air. Below, the street was a sea of black SUVs and white trailers marked with the biohazard symbol. Men in thick, yellow level A hazmat suits moved like slow-motion astronauts through the lobby, their heavy boots echoing where Mark had once walked with his grocery bags. Officer Miller was being loaded into a stretcher by 2 paramedics who had climbed the stairs. He gave Mark a brief, pained nod before the door to the roof closed. Mark was alone with the cooling units and the silence. He looked down at the leather-bound journal. The spine was scratched from where he had forced it into the manual override, but the pages within were still a ticking time bomb of information. "You should give that to me, Mr. Mark." The voice didn't come from a tactical officer or a frantic worker. It was steady, authoritative, and came from a woman standing near the ledge. She wore a dark trench coat and held a badge that didn't belong to the local police. "Agent Vance," she said, though she didn't step closer. "Specialized Records Division. I believe you found something that belongs to my great-grandfather." Mark tightened his grip on the book. "Julian Vane. You're a descendant. The black sheep of the family." She replied, her eyes tracking the movement of the hazmat teams below. "My family has been trying to clean up Julian's library for 3 generations. He wasn't just a collector, he was a paranoiac who believed that secrets were the only way to ensure the survival of the elite. That vial in 4B. It wasn't just a weapon. It was his final statement on human nature, that we would rather destroy ourselves than let our secrets be known." "And what happens to the journal now?" Mark asked. "There are names in here. People who are still alive. People whose lives will be ruined if this gets out. That's why the government is here," Vance said, finally stepping forward. "We don't want a scandal, Mark. We want stability. The information in that book could topple 3 different departments and half the city council. We're not here to prosecute, we're here to bury it." Mark looked at the book. He thought about Elena, who had been kidnapped for the sake of these secrets. He thought about Sarah, who had risked her life to find the truth. And he thought about David, the broker who wanted to sell it all to the highest bidder. "If you bury it," Mark said, "the cycle just starts again. Someone else will find another dead space in another building. Someone else will use this leverage. The Silver Oak is being condemned," Vance said flatly. "By noon, it will be designated a Superfund site. The residents are being relocated. The building will be gutted, and the dead spaces filled with concrete. The library ends today. She held out her hand. Mark looked at the journal. He knew she was right. The information was too dangerous for any one person to hold. But he also knew that specialized records was just another way of saying deep storage. He handed her the book. As her fingers closed over the leather, the iron key Mark had left in 4B suddenly flashed in his mind. He hadn't told her about the digital archive on the 7th floor. He hadn't told her that the EMP he triggered had likely scrambled the main servers, but hadn't destroyed them. "Thank you, Mr. Mark," Vance said, tucked the book into her coat. "A car is waiting for you downstairs. You'll be given a generous settlement for your inconvenience and a new apartment across town. I suggest you take the money and write that travel article about the Mediterranean. Stay away from old buildings for a while." She turned and walked toward the stairs. Mark stayed on the roof, watching her go. He reached into his pocket and felt the small vellum scroll he had hidden there earlier. He hadn't given her the whole puzzle. He looked at the scroll. "Look to the light that reveals the shadow." He realized then that the light wasn't the moonlight. It was the truth. And the shadow wasn't just a projection on a wall. It was the secret history of the city itself. He wasn't going to the Mediterranean. He had one more stop to make. The generous settlement offered by Agent Vance sat in a sleek black envelope on the passenger seat of the sedan that had whisked Mark away from the Silver Oak. But Mark didn't look at it. He directed the driver to a small, 24-hour internet cafe in a neighborhood where the buildings were made of glass and steel, places with no dead spaces and no history. Mark sat in a cramped booth at the back. The smell of burnt coffee and cleaning fluid a welcome change from the ozone and ancient dust. He pulled the small vellum scroll from his pocket. On the back of the parchment, barely visible unless held at a specific angle against the monitor's glow, was a string of 16 characters. The encryption key. Mark whispered. He knew Agent Vance would be wiping the servers on the 7th floor of the Silver Oak by now. But Sarah had mentioned something during their climb. The building's internal Wi-Fi had been linked to a cloud backup used by Henderson for his travel agency. Mark logged into a secure terminal. He navigated to the local node that handled the Silver Oak's digital traffic. Because the building was now a Superfund site, the local ISP had flagged the account for suspension, but it hadn't been purged yet. He entered the 16 characters. The screen flickered, then a single folder appeared. The third circle. As the files began to download, Mark realized David was right about one thing. Information was a currency. But David wanted to spend it. Julian Vane wanted to hoard it. Mark just wanted to understand it. The first file he opened was a video clip, time-stamped from the previous week. It was a hidden camera feed from the lobby. He saw himself walking in with his suitcases, looking hopeful and tired. Then the camera panned to Mr. Henderson, who was watching Mark on a monitor in his office. Henderson wasn't just checking a tenant in. He was checking a piece onto a board. Then, a second folder caught his eye. Vane_correspondence_1949. Inside were scanned letters from Julian Vane to an unknown recipient in Switzerland. The vessel is secure, but the architecture is the true master. If the bone crown is ever moved, the bellows will sigh. I have ensured that the Silver Oak will remain a sentinel long after I am gone. The truth is not in the vial. It is in the people who are willing to kill for it. Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. Vane hadn't been a mad scientist. He had been a sociologist with a terrifyingly dark view of humanity. The plague vial was a test. If the building's secrets were ever pursued with enough greed to trigger the sanitization, Vane believed the world deserved the consequences. Suddenly, a message box popped up on the screen. It wasn't a system alert. I knew you wouldn't go to the Mediterranean. Mark. Mark's heart skipped. Sarah. He typed back. The Bureau thinks they have the journal, But I saw you with the scroll on the roof. They're tracking your GPS. But I've put your signal on a loop at the airport. You have 20 minutes before they realize you aren't on the flight to Rome. What do I do with this? The third circle files. It's all here. The blackmail, the forgeries, the history. You can't publish it, Mark. If you do, the people in that book will hunt you to the ends of the earth. But you can't let Vance bury it either. A secret buried is just a secret waiting to be found again. Upload it to the archive of the invisible. It's a decentralized leak site. No one owns it. No one can delete it. Let the truth belong to everyone, so no one can use it as a weapon again. Mark looked at the upload button. He thought about the silver oak, its beautiful facade and its rotten heart. He thought about Elena, who was now safe but forever changed. He clicked the button. A progress bar appeared. 1%, 5%, 12%. Outside, a black SUV pulled up to the curb of the cafe. Two men in suits stepped out, looking at their phones and then at the cafe's neon sign. Mark had 10 minutes left. The progress bar on the screen felt agonizingly slow. 42%. 45%. Mark watched the two men in suits through the steam of his cooling coffee. They weren't moving with the urgency of a tactical team. They were calm, methodical, checking the perimeter. They believed they had time. They believed the man they were tracking was already halfway to a terminal at JFK. They're at the door. Mark. You need to move now. Leave the terminal running. It's a ghost connection. They won't be able to trace the destination once it's in the mesh. Mark typed one last message. What about you, Sarah? If they find out you helped me. I was never here. And neither were you. Check the back service door behind the kitchen. There's a grey scooter with a helmet on the handlebars. The keys are in the glove box. Go to the pier. The connection severed. The screen went back to a generic login prompt, though the hidden background process continued its silent upload. Mark stood up, grabbing his worn leather jacket. He didn't look back at the monitor. He walked toward the back of the cafe, slipping past a confused barista who was busy restocking napkins. The service door opened into a narrow, trash-strewn alley. The morning sun was blocked by the surrounding skyscrapers, leaving the air damp and smelling of wet cardboard. True to Sarah's word, a nondescript grey scooter was idling near a stack of crates. Mark slid the helmet on, his hands shaking as he gripped the handlebars. The pursuit. As Mark kicked the scooter into gear and pulled out of the alley, he saw the black SUV lurch into motion in his rearview mirror. They hadn't seen him leave, but the moment he entered the main street, their loop on his phone signal must have glitched. Mark didn't head for the highway. He stayed in the narrow side streets of the Diamond District, weaving between yellow taxis and delivery trucks. The large SUV was powerful but bulky. Mark's scooter could slip through gaps that were inches wide. If he hit a red light or a dead end, he was trapped. He reached the pier in 6 minutes. The wind off the river was fierce, smelling of salt and diesel. He ditched the scooter behind a row of shipping containers and ran toward the edge of the dock. A small, weathered ferry was just pulling away from the slip, its engines churning the dark water into white foam. Wait! Mark shouted, waving his arms. A deckhand, a man with skin like tanned leather and a cigarette tucked behind his ear, looked at him. He didn't ask for a ticket. He just reached out a calloused hand and hauled Mark over the railing as the gap between the boat and the pier widened to 5 feet. Mark collapsed onto the deck, gasping for air. He looked back at the shore. The two men in suits stood at the edge of the pier, watching the ferry retreat. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't yell. One of them simply pulled out a radio and spoke into it. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He removed the battery and their SIM card, watching them skip across the water before sinking into the depths. He was off the grid. He looked at the city skyline. The silver oak was visible in the distance, a thin finger of stone and glass rising above the shorter buildings. It looked peaceful from here. It looked like a place where people lived normal lives, drank coffee, and dreamed of the future. Going to the islands? The deckhand asked, leaning against the rail. Just going. Mark replied. He felt the weight of the vellum scroll in his inner pocket. The upload was likely finished by now. The secrets of Julian Vane were no longer a weapon. They were a flood. And as the ferry moved further into the harbor, Mark realized that while he had lost his home, he had finally stopped being a character in someone else's story. He was the author now. The ferry groaned as it cut through the choppy waters of the harbor, heading toward a small, fog-shrouded landmass known locally as St. Jude's. It wasn't a tourist destination. It was a place of fading industry and forgotten warehouses. As the boat docked, Mark stepped onto the splintered wood of the pier. He felt like a ghost returning to a world that had moved on without him. Following the instructions Sarah had sent to his now-destroyed phone via a final encrypted burst, Mark navigated the maze of rusted shipping containers until he reached a small, two-story structure that had once been a lighthouse keeper's cottage. The door opened before he could knock. Elena stood there. She looked better than she had in the basement. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Sarah said you'd make it," she said, stepping back to let him in. The inside of the cottage was a stark contrast to the silver oak. There was no crown molding, no hidden cameras, and no dead spaces. It was filled with old books, mismatched furniture, and a large, wooden table covered in maps and printed documents. "Where is Sarah?" Mark asked, looking around the small room. "Back in the city, playing the role of the dutiful investigator," Elena replied. "She has to stay close to the bureau to make sure the official story of the silver oak stays consistent. They're calling it a structural instability caused by an illegal construction project in the basement. They've completely scrubbed the mention of the bone crown or the plague vial." Mark sat down at the table. "And the upload? The archive of the invisible?" Elena pulled a laptop toward him. The screen showed a global heat map. Thousands of red dots were blinking across every continent. "You did it, Mark. The files have been mirrored over 4,000 times. Every journalist, historian, and curious hacker on the planet is currently decoding Julian Vane's library. The secret history of the city is now public domain." "And the consequences?" Mark asked. "The fallout has already started," Elena said, her voice dropping. "2 city council members resigned an hour ago. A major hedge fund is being investigated for the wartime profiteering Vane documented. But more importantly, the archivist network is in a panic. David and his buyers have lost their leverage. You didn't just leak a book. You broke a system of control that has existed since 1946. Mark looked at the maps on the table. He noticed a specific area circled in red, a remote region in the Alps. "What's this?" "Vane's original home," Elena explained. "Before he came to the city, he was part of a group called the Order of the Third Circle. They weren't just blackmailers. They were a brotherhood dedicated to preserving the balance through the management of dangerous truths. The Silver Oak was just one of their outposts. There are others, Mark. In London, in Paris, in Berlin." Mark felt a cold weight in his chest. "So it's not over." "The Silver Oak chapter is over," Elena said, leaning forward. "But the people who funded Henderson and Kovac are still out there. They lost a library, but they still have the architects. And now, they know your name." Suddenly, a low, rhythmic thrumming sound echoed through the cottage. It wasn't the wind or the waves. It was the sound of a heavy-lift helicopter approaching from the direction of the city. "They found us," Mark said, standing up. "Not necessarily." Elena said, grabbing a bag and a heavy iron key, a twin to the one Mark had seen in the fireplace. "But we aren't staying to find out. Sarah has a boat waiting on the south side of the island. We're going to the one place Vane's maps say doesn't exist." The sound of the helicopter intensified, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse against the very walls of the cottage. Mark and Elena moved with a synchronized urgency, a silent understanding born from the chaos they had survived. He grabbed the leather satchel containing the few remaining physical documents from the Silver Oak, while Elena secured the laptop and the second iron key. "The south side is all jagged rock and old piers," Mark said, peering through the salt-encrusted window. "There's no clear path for a boat in this fog." "Sarah doesn't use clear paths," Elena replied, her voice tight but certain. "She uses the currents Julian Vane mapped out for his own escape. Follow me, and stay low." They slipped out the back door, staying beneath the line of the tall, yellowed sea grass. The fog was their only ally, a thick, white shroud that muffled the roar of the helicopter circling above the lighthouse. Every time the searchlight cut through the mist, Mark felt like a moth in a predator's sights. They reached the edge of the cliff. Below them, the Atlantic was a churning, grey beast, smashing against the foundations of a half-sunken pier. It looked like a death trap, but as they descended the narrow, stone-cut steps, a shape emerged from the gloom. It was a black, low-profile rigid inflatable boat, its twin engines idling. Standing at the helm, silhouetted against the spray, was Sarah. She looked like a ghost in her tactical gear, her eyes scanning the heights. "Get in. Now," she hissed over the wind. Mark and Elena scrambled into the boat. The moment they were aboard, Sarah slammed the throttles forward. The boat didn't just move, it leaped. The acceleration threw Mark back against the gear lockers as they veered away from the island, the hull slapping against the waves with bone-jarring force. "They're tracking the digital signature of that laptop," Sarah shouted over the roar of the wind. "I've got a jammer running, but it won't hold them off for long once they deploy the drones." "Who are they, Sarah?" Mark asked, clutching the railing. "The Bureau. Or the Order?" "Both," Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on the GPS. "In this city, the line between the government and the Order of the Third Circle is a smudge on a map. You didn't just leak a ledger, you exposed the shadow cabinet that has been running the infrastructure for half a century." As they cleared the island's wake, the helicopter appeared behind them, its spotlight sweeping the water like a giant, angry eye. "Mark, the satchel!" Elena yelled, pointing at the documents. "There's a small, lead-lined pouch in the bottom. Put the second key inside it. It's an active transponder. If it's out in the open, they can see us from space." Mark fumbled with the bag, his fingers numb from the cold spray. He found the pouch and dropped the heavy iron key inside, sealing the magnetic strip. Instantly, the helicopter's searchlight jerked away, scanning a patch of empty ocean 500 yards to their left. The ghost had been silenced. "We're heading for the international line," Sarah said, her grip tightening on the wheel. "Once we're in open water, we meet a freighter called the Silent Oak. It's a sister ship to the building's original owner. It's the only place they can't touch us." Mark looked back at the receding skyline of the city. The Silver Oak was now just a distant needle in a haystack of lights. He realized that they weren't just fleeing, they were embarking on a global scavenger hunt for the truth. The story of the apartment was over, but the story of the architect's world was just beginning. The Atlantic was a vast, obsidian mirror, broken only by the rhythmic white wake of the Silent Oak. The freighter was an old, rust-streaked Titan, its name barely legible on the bow. It didn't belong to any fleet. It was a ghost of the merchant marines, a sovereign territory that moved with the currents of the world. Mark stood on the bridge wing, the salt air drying on his skin. Behind him, the coast of America had vanished below the horizon, taking with it the life he had known, the travel articles, the quiet apartment hunt, the illusion of a simple world. In his pocket, the vellum scroll was a constant, papery weight, a reminder that some truths, once seen, can never be forgotten. Sarah walked out to join him, her tactical gear replaced by a heavy wool sweater. She looked older in the moonlight, the lines of exhaustion finally showing on her face. "The freighter's crew are sentinels," she explained, leaning against the cold railing. "They're the ones who broke away from the order decades ago. They've been waiting for someone to finally trip the great bellows in the Silver Oak." "So the building was a signal," Mark said. "It was a flare," Sarah corrected. "By releasing the archive, you didn't just expose the criminals. You signaled to the others, the ones in London, Paris, and Berlin, that the architect's hold is slipping. The system of control depends on silence. You've made the world very loud, Mark." Elena emerged from the cabin, holding 3 mugs of steaming, bitter coffee. She handed one to Mark. "The download is complete," she said quietly. "The archive of the invisible has been mirrored on every major darknet hub. The Shadow Cabinet is spending millions trying to douse the fire, but you can't ring a bell." Mark looked at the 2 women. They were no longer just a neighbor and a mysterious investigator. They were a team, the first cell of a new resistance. Vane's journal mentioned a 3rd circle, Mark said, remembering the text. He said the first circle is the secret. The second is the leverage. What is the third? Sarah looked out at the endless water. The third circle is the people. The ones who live in the buildings, walk the streets, and eventually decide that the secrets are no longer worth the price of their freedom. As the sun began to rise, painting the edge of the world in a defiant, golden fire, Mark felt a strange sense of peace. He had moved into the Silver Oak looking for a story, and he had found the story of a lifetime, one that was still being written. He looked at the satchel on the deck, containing the bone crown and the sealed vial, now safely locked in the freighter's specialized hold. "What now?" Mark asked. "Now," Sarah said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "We go to London. There's an old library near the Thames that has a ventilation system that hums in the key of C#. I think you'll find the architecture very familiar." Mark took a sip of the coffee, the heat spreading through his chest. He wasn't a travel writer anymore. He was a cartographer of the hidden, a hunter of the unseen. He looked at the horizon, where the light was finally revealing the shadows of the world, and he realized that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The Silver Oak was gone, but the forest was just beginning to wake up.